The courtroom laughed. Not loudly at first. Just a few sharp chuckles from the polished men in tailored suits seated behind my father. Then a low ripple spread through the old Charleston probate chamber, like wind moving across dry leaves. Even the bailiff looked away to hide his smile. My father stood at the plaintiff's table, one hand resting on polished walnut, as though he already owned the room. His silver hair combed perfectly into place, his navy suit pressed so sharply it could have cut paper. "Your Honor," he said, his voice smooth and practiced, "my daughter can barely pay rent." A few more laughs. The judge leaned back in his chair and folded his hands over his stomach. The corners of his mouth curled upward. "And she expects to control a $31 million estate." This time the room laughed openly. My stepmother Linda gave one soft, elegant clap of amusement before covering her mouth as if embarrassed by her own delight. I sat quietly at the defense table in my second-hand gray blazer, hands folded neatly in my lap, my face calm. The judge shook his head. "Well, Miss Whitmore, this ought to be interesting." Then I stood. The sound of my chair scraping across the hardwood floor sliced through the laughter. Every eye in that courtroom shifted to me. I looked directly at the judge and said, "I'm the federally appointed receiver of Whitmore Holdings, effective 8 o'clock this morning." The laughter died so fast it felt stolen. The judge's smile vanished. And for the first time in my father's life, Harold Whitmore looked afraid. 3 hours earlier, I had stood in front of the bathroom mirror of my one-bedroom apartment on Rutledge Avenue and adjusted the sleeves of that same gray blazer. The apartment wasn't much, 600 square feet above an old hardware store downtown. The plumbing rattled when the upstairs neighbor showered, and the kitchen window stuck every summer from the humidity rolling in off Charleston Harbor. But it was clean, paid for, and mine. The coffee maker hissed behind me while morning traffic drifted faintly through the cracked window. I remember looking at myself and thinking how ordinary I appeared. A 46-year-old widow with sensible shoes and faint lines at the corners of her eyes, no diamonds, no designer handbag, no sign of power. That had always made people underestimate me, my father especially. The phone rang at exactly 7:12 a.m. I answered on the second ring. "Miss Whitmore." The voice was clipped and formal. "Yes. This is Thomas Avery with the Federal Trust Oversight Office. I'm calling to confirm activation of the Samuel Whitmore Irrevocable Successor Trust. Appointment authority transferred as of 800 hours. I closed my eyes. Even though I had expected the call, hearing those words made my chest tighten. "It's official." "Yes, ma'am." "And Harold. He has been formally stripped of all discretionary authority pending forensic review." I was silent for a moment, not because I was celebrating, because I could hear my grandfather's voice in my memory. "Money doesn't reveal character, Evelyn. It magnifies it." "Thank you," I said quietly. Then I hung up and poured my coffee. No shaking hands, no tears, just stillness. Granddaddy had prepared me for this years ago. I simply hadn't known when the day would come. I was 12 the first time Samuel Whitmore tested me. The family had gathered at his summer home on Sullivan's Island for one of his elaborate Sunday dinners. My father spent the entire evening bragging to investors about Whitmore Textile's newest acquisition, while Mother smiled politely beside him, already exhausted by his hunger for approval. After dessert, Granddaddy called me into his study. The room smelled of pipe tobacco and old leather. He handed me an envelope. Inside was a cashier's check for $50,000. I stared at it. "There's been a mistake," I said. He smiled. "What makes you think that—" "It's too much. My college fund isn't that large." He leaned back in his chair and watched me carefully. Most children would have celebrated. Maybe hidden it. Maybe spent it in their imagination before the ink dried. I handed it back. "You should tell your accountant." His smile deepened. "That's what I hoped you'd say." Years later, after I was grown, he admitted it had been a test. Not of honesty alone. Of instinct. He believed integrity was often immediate, not calculated. You either reached for what wasn't yours, or you didn't. My father would have kept the check. Granddaddy already knew that. After my mother died when I was 28, everything changed. She had been the one softening Harold's edges. Without her, his ambition sharpened into something colder. Within 18 months, he married Linda Prescott, a woman 20 years younger with perfect posture, polished vowels, and the social instincts of a shark scenting blood. Linda understood quickly that Harold's greatest weakness was insecurity. He had spent his entire life trying to impress a father who valued principle over profit, and Samuel had never fully trusted him. Linda fed that wound. "You built this company into something greater than Samuel ever imagined," she would tell him. "You deserve total control." Harold believed her because he needed to. When my husband Michael got sick years later, I left Charleston to care for him in Ohio. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. 14 months of hospice nurses whispered prayers at 2 in the morning. I would have done it for 14 years if it meant one more day. But Michael died in February with snow falling softly outside our Cleveland window. After the funeral, I came home broke, widowed, 42 years old and starting over. Father called me weak, said Michael's illness had become my excuse for failure. He offered money once. When I refused, he never offered again. Instead, he told anyone who asked that I had squandered my inheritance, that I lacked discipline, that I had become exactly what happens when people are given too much and expected too little. He said it so often Charleston society accepted it as fact. It became my reputation. Poor Evelyn. Couldn't manage life. Could barely pay rent. Which, to be fair, had occasionally been true. But while Father was telling those stories over cocktails at the Carolina Yacht Club, I was rebuilding quietly, working part-time at the Charleston Public Library, studying estate law at night, volunteering with a nonprofit that investigated elder financial abuse, learning how greed leaves fingerprints, learning how pride always overplays its hand, and all the while Granddaddy's sealed trust waited, silent, patient, until Harold made his move. Last month, he filed probate action to consolidate full ownership of Whitmore Holdings under his sole authority. That filing triggered everything, exactly as Samuel designed. And now here we were, in court. My father smiling, the judge smirking, the room laughing, none of them understanding that the world they thought Harold controlled had already shifted beneath their feet. As I stood before that courtroom and watched the color drain from my father's face, I thought of Granddaddy sitting in his leather chair all those years ago, testing a little girl with a check she could have stolen. He had known something none of us understood then. Character takes years to build, and only one moment to reveal itself. The judge adjusted his glasses and looked down at the federal document in his trembling hand. Then he looked back at me and spoke 5 words that changed everything. "Miss Whitmore, explain this immediately." The judge's voice carried across the courtroom like a crack of thunder. "Miss Whitmore, explain this immediately." For a moment no one moved. Not my father. Not Linda. Not the lawyers who had spent the last 40 minutes polishing my humiliation into legal argument. The old Charleston courthouse had gone still in that peculiar southern way, where silence somehow feels louder than shouting. Even the ceiling fan overhead seemed to hesitate. I looked down at the federal trust certification in the judge's trembling hand and felt a strange calm settle over me. This was the moment my grandfather had spent years preparing me for. And somehow standing there in that faded gray blazer with my father's empire hanging in the balance, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired. The kind of tired that comes after carrying a truth too heavy for too long. I folded my hands in front of me. My grandfather established the Samuel Whitmore Irrevocable Successor Trust 17 years ago, I said evenly. Across the aisle, Father's jaw tightened. "That is absurd," he snapped. The judge lifted a hand sharply. "You'll remain silent, Mr. Whitmore." Father obeyed, though his face had gone a dangerous shade of red. I continued. The trust was sealed under federal fiduciary review. It included a dormant succession clause, triggered by any attempt to consolidate Whitmore Holdings through probate manipulation. Linda's face drained of color. She knew exactly what that meant. Harold's filing last month his carefully orchestrated petition to absorb all corporate voting authority into his personal control had activated the clause. He had sprung the trap himself. The judge adjusted his glasses and scanned the page again. His earlier smirk had vanished completely. "And you were named successor receiver?" "Yes, Your Honor." "Why?" That question landed harder than I expected. Why me? It was the same question my father had spent half my life asking. Why had Samuel trusted his granddaughter more than his only son? Why had the old man looked at me and seen strength where Harold saw weakness? I glanced toward my father. His expression wasn't anger now. It was something closer to confusion. The answer to that question began 40 years earlier. I was 6 years old the first time Granddaddy took me to the textile mill. Most little girls in Charleston spent summer mornings at writing lessons or piano recitals. Not me. Samuel Whitmore believed children learned more from honest work than polite applause. So while Father attended executive breakfasts downtown, Granddaddy brought me to Whitmore Textile Plant No. 3 just outside Somerville. The mill was enormous. Brick walls blackened with age. Massive looms clattering like thunder. The air smelled of cotton dust and machine oil. I remember clutching his hand as we walked the production floor, my tiny fingers swallowed by his broad palm. He stopped every few feet to greet workers by name. Not because he had to, because he knew them. "Morning, Earl. How's your wife feeling? Tell your boy congratulations on the scholarship, Janet. Good to see you back, Miguel. Heard your mother's surgery went well." He remembered everything. Afterward, we sat in his office drinking lemonade from paper cups while he explained the business to me. Not profits, not stock prices, people. "These machines matter because families depend on them," he said. "A company that forgets its people becomes a machine itself. And machines have no conscience." I didn't fully understand then, but I remembered. Years later, Harold forgot that lesson completely. Granddaddy never did. By the time I was 29, Samuel had grown quieter. Age had bent his shoulders slightly, though his mind remained sharp enough to frighten every attorney in Charleston. That was the year he discovered Harold had begun quietly leveraging company assets to finance speculative luxury developments in Florida. High-risk projects, massive debt exposure, no board disclosure, no family approval. When Samuel confronted him, Father denied everything, then blamed modern market realities. "Expansion requires vision," Harold had said. Samuel's answer was simple. "Vision without conscience is appetite." Father stormed out of the house and didn't speak to him for nearly 3 months. That autumn, Samuel called me to his study. I can still picture the room. Dark mahogany shelves, a fire crackling softly despite the October warmth, his bourbon untouched beside his chair. He looked older than I had ever seen him. Not weak, just worn. "Evelyn," he said quietly, "do you know why your father has spent his life resenting me?" I shook my head. He gave a tired smile. "Because he thinks trust is something earned through success." He gestured for me to sit. But trust isn't awarded for achievement. It's revealed through character. Then he opened a thick legal folder and slid it across the desk. Inside were trust documents, corporate structures, federal escrow certifications. At 29, I barely understood half of it. But I understood enough. "You're naming me." He nodded. "Only if Harold forces my hand." I stared at him. Why would he? Granddaddy looked toward the fire. "Because men who hunger for control rarely recognize when enough has become too much." I remember feeling sick. "I don't want this." That, he said softly, is precisely why you must have it. I looked up. He met my eyes steadily. "Your father wants ownership because he believes it will finally prove his worth. But ownership never heals insecurity. It only magnifies it." His voice lowered. "If the day comes when this activates, promise me one thing." "What?" "Save the company, not the fortune, the people." I nodded through tears. He smiled then. The same warm, steady smile he'd worn my whole life. "Good girl." He died 6 weeks later. Peacefully. In his sleep. At his funeral, Father cried harder than I had ever seen. But even then, I knew some of those tears came from something deeper than grief. He had lost his last chance to win Samuel's approval. And men can spend their lives chasing what pride will never let them receive. Back in the courtroom, I met the judge's eyes. "That's why he chose me, Your Honor." No one spoke. The old clock on the rear wall ticked softly. Father looked smaller somehow. Not physically. Spiritually. Like a man suddenly realizing he had misunderstood his entire life. "That's impossible," he said hoarsely. He would have told me. I looked at him carefully. No, Father, he wouldn't. The truth hit him harder than any accusation could have. Because deep down, Harold Whitmore already knew it was true. He had always known. The judge cleared his throat. "Mr. Whitmore's probate authority is suspended pending immediate forensic review." Gasps rippled through the gallery. Linda grabbed Father's sleeve. "Harold, do something." But he couldn't. For the first time in 74 years, Harold Whitmore had no move left to make. Then the courtroom doors opened, and 3 federal forensic auditors walked inside carrying sealed black cases. The lead investigator approached the bench and spoke words that made Linda audibly gasp. "Your Honor, we've identified substantial evidence of concealed fiduciary misconduct." My father turned toward me slowly. His face had gone ghost white, and in that instant I realized something heartbreaking. He wasn't afraid of prison. He was afraid Granddaddy had been right about him all along. The sound Linda made was small and sharp, like a glass cracking under pressure. Not a scream, not even a gasp, really. Just the involuntary sound of someone realizing the floor beneath them has already given way. My father didn't move. He stood there at the plaintiff's table with his face drained pale beneath the courtroom lights, staring at the 3 federal auditors, as if they had stepped out of some fever dream. The lead investigator, a tall woman in her 50s with iron-gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses, placed a sealed folder on the bench. "Special Auditor Karen Dorsey, Federal Trust Oversight," she said. The judge nodded stiffly. "Proceed." She opened the folder and began laying out document after document with practiced precision. Wire transfers, asset transfers, shell corporation registrations, loan structures, tax filings. The language was dry and technical, but the meaning was devastatingly clear. My father had spent the last 12 years quietly draining Whitmore Holdings through layered corporate entities disguised as growth investments, luxury coastal developments in Florida, speculative resort properties in the Carolinas, private offshore accounts routed through Delaware and Nevada holding companies, millions moved carefully enough to avoid casual scrutiny. Not theft in the crude sense, not envelopes stuffed with cash or dramatic embezzlement. Something worse. The kind of greed that dresses itself in legality and dares anyone to notice. The courtroom sat frozen. Judge Carlisle adjusted his glasses again and again, as though changing the angle might somehow change what he was reading. Linda gripped the edge of the plaintiff's table so tightly her knuckles blanched white. And Harold Whitmore, my father, the man Charleston society had admired for decades, looked suddenly very old. Not distinguished. Not commanding. Just old. Auditor Dorsey's voice remained calm. "Our preliminary findings indicate approximately $11.4 million in concealed liabilities tied to non-disclosed speculative exposure." A murmur swept through the room. 11 million? Even in Charleston, where old money floated quietly behind historic facades and private club memberships, that number landed like an earthquake. The judge looked over his glasses. "Mr. Whitmore, were these liabilities disclosed to your board?" Father swallowed. "Number. Were they disclosed to trust oversight?" Silence. The judge's voice sharpened. "Answer the question. Number?" His voice came out brittle and thin. It was the first time in my life I had ever heard fear crack through Harold Whitmore's confidence. And strangely enough, I felt no satisfaction. Only sadness, because this wasn't the moment he became this man. It was simply the moment everyone else finally saw him clearly. The truth had started revealing itself months earlier. At first, it was just small inconsistencies buried in public financial disclosures. I noticed them one evening at the library while helping archive municipal tax records. Most people imagine libraries as quiet places where nothing important happens. But if you know where to look, every secret eventually leaves paper behind. I had spent years volunteering with Charleston Elder Advocacy Services, helping elderly residents identify financial exploitation by family members and predatory caretakers. The work teaches you something invaluable. Greed always leaves patterns. People think deception is creativity. It isn't. It's repetition. Repeated concealment. Repeated rationalization. Repeated little choices that slowly become a life. That night I was cross-referencing trust property tax filings when one valuation caught my eye. A Hilton Head development listed under a corporate shell I recognized from Whitmore Holdings disclosures. Except the debt structure attached to it made no sense. Too aggressive. Too leveraged. I checked another. Then another. By midnight I had 6 discrepancies. By 2 in the morning I knew exactly what Father was doing. He was mortgaging the company's future to manufacture the illusion of present success. Classic insecurity economics. Dress up risk as vision. Call recklessness innovation. Count applause as proof of wisdom. I sat there beneath the soft yellow reading lamps of the Charleston Public Library and stared at the numbers until my coffee went cold. Then I thought of Granddaddy, of his steady voice. Ownership never heals insecurity. It magnifies it. That was the night I contacted Federal Trust Oversight and formally submitted activation evidence under the Dormant Succession Clause. The process moved quietly, professionally, without drama, which was exactly how Granddaddy designed it. He understood something my father never did. Real power rarely announces itself. It simply arrives when needed. Back in court, Father found his voice. "This is absurd." He pointed at me, his hand trembling. "She orchestrated this." "No," I said quietly. He turned fully toward me. "You've been spying on this family for years. The accusation hung there. Sharp. Ugly. Pathetic." I met his eyes. "No, Father. I was paying attention." The words landed harder than I intended, because they were true in more ways than one. All my life, Harold had mistaken attention for obedience. He believed if I wasn't fighting him, I must be yielding. He never understood that silence often means observation, and observation eventually becomes understanding. Linda suddenly spoke, her voice tight with panic. Harold told me these were temporary restructures. You said everything was protected. Father stared at her. For one raw second, his polished social mask slipped completely, and I saw the frightened little boy granddaddy once described, the one forever trying to prove he mattered. I was fixing it, he whispered. Linda stepped back as if he'd struck her. That was when I understood she had never loved him. Not really. She loved proximity to power, and now that power was evaporating in real time. She looked around the courtroom, calculating, measuring exits. Social survival often wears expensive perfume. Judge Carlisle struck his gavel. Enough. The room jolted. He looked directly at Father. Harold Whitmore, pending federal review, your control of Whitmore Holdings is hereby suspended effective immediately. Silence. Then the words that truly ended his empire. All discretionary authority transfers to Miss Evelyn Whitmore. A sound escaped Father's throat. Not anger, not protest. Something deeper. The sound of identity collapsing. For 74 years, Harold Whitmore had believed control made him significant. Now control was gone, and he had no idea who remained. The judge turned to me. Miss Whitmore, this court recognizes your authority under federal succession trust law. I nodded once. Steady. Professional. Inside my heart was pounding so hard I thought everyone might hear it. Then Auditor Dorsey leaned toward the bench and quietly added, Your Honor, there is one further matter requiring immediate attention. The judge frowned. What matter? She opened another folder. The look on her face changed. Not surprise. Not concern. Recognition. As though she had finally reached the worst page in a terrible book. Then she spoke words that made my stomach drop. We've located evidence suggesting Mrs. Linda Whitmore may have participated directly in fraudulent asset concealment. Linda's face went white, and for the first time all morning, she looked at Harold not with loyalty, but with betrayal. If you've lived long enough, you learn there are many kinds of silence. There's the peaceful kind, like dawn settling over Charleston Harbor before the fishing boats begin their engines. There's the lonely kind, the one that fills a house after someone you love has died. And then there's the silence of truth arriving all at once. That was the silence that settled over Judge Carlisle's courtroom when Auditor Dorsey spoke Linda's name. It was so complete I could hear the soft, electric hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Linda Whitmore had spent nearly 20 years moving through Charleston society like polished silver. She chaired hospital galas, hosted Christmas charity auctions in our family's historic South Battery home, remembered everyone's birthdays, every anniversary, every social detail that mattered. Women envied her elegance. Men admired her composure. She knew exactly how to stand, smile, and tilt her head to suggest warmth without ever giving too much away. And now, for the first time since I had known her, that composure shattered. Her lips parted slightly. Her carefully manicured fingers released Harold's sleeve as though touching him had suddenly become dangerous. What did you say? Her voice came out thin and brittle. Auditor Dorsey didn't blink. We have evidence indicating your authorization on multiple concealed transfer approvals tied to Seaview Coastal Development and Marshlight Holdings. Linda's eyes snapped to Harold. For a moment, no one in the courtroom existed but the two of them. And what passed between them in that instant was not love. It was recognition. The terrible kind. The kind people share when they both understand exactly how much they've lied to each other. Harold's mouth opened, closed, then opened again. Linda, you told me those signatures were procedural. Her voice was rising now, losing all of its practiced Southern polish. You said those were compliance acknowledgments. His face twitched. Keep your voice down. She laughed. Actually laughed. It was a sharp, unbelieving sound that echoed off the paneled courtroom walls. Keep my voice down. Then she turned to the judge, her eyes bright with panic. He told me these were legal restructures. I signed where counsel instructed. Harold's expression hardened. For the first time all morning, anger returned to him. Not the cool executive displeasure Charleston knew so well. Real anger. The kind men reveal when control slips through their fingers. Careful, he said quietly. Linda stared at him. And in her face, I saw the exact moment she understood something she should have realized years earlier. Harold Whitmore would sacrifice anyone to protect his pride. Even her. Especially her. Judge Carlisle struck his gavel sharply. Enough. Mrs. Whitmore, you will remain available for federal questioning. Linda sank into her chair. Her hands trembled visibly. The woman who had once corrected my posture at dinner parties now looked small and frightened, and suddenly very human. And I felt an unexpected flicker of pity. Because I knew what it was like to realize too late that someone you trusted had built your life on illusion. I learned that lesson in Ohio. The winter Michael died was the coldest Cleveland had seen in years. Snow pressed against our apartment windows in heavy drifts, muffling the world outside until everything felt suspended in white silence. Hospice had set up a narrow bed in the living room because Michael wanted to face the window. He said he liked watching the snowfall, said it reminded him the world could still be beautiful even while disappearing. By then, the cancer had taken most of his strength. His hands, once broad and steady from years repairing machinery, had grown so thin I could feel every bone when I held them. One night, about 3 weeks before he died, he woke just after midnight. The room was dark except for the street lamp glow filtering through the curtains. He looked at me sitting beside him and smiled faintly. "You should go home." I squeezed his hand. "This is home." "No." His voice was weak but certain. "Charleston." I shook my head. "There's nothing there for me." He studied me for a long moment. Then he said something I didn't understand until years later. "You've spent your whole life waiting for your father to see you clearly." I looked away. Even dying Michael could still read me too well. "He never will," he said softly. The truth hurt because I already knew it. Michael's fingers tightened around mine. "Stop building your worth around someone else's blindness." I cried quietly beside his bed while snow drifted past the window. He passed 17 days later with my hand in his. After the funeral, I sat alone in our apartment staring at the empty recliner by the window. Everything was still, and for the first time in my life I understood something freedom often feels like: grief. Because when illusion finally dies, what remains is painful, but real. That was the lesson Michael gave me, and it saved me. I came home to Charleston with almost nothing. No money, no husband, no clear future. But I also came home with a kind of honesty I had never possessed before. I no longer needed Harold Whitmore's approval to know my own worth. That changed everything. Quietly. Permanently. It was what allowed me to stand in that courtroom now without fear. Not because I had won, because I no longer needed to. Back at counsel table, my father looked at me differently. For years, his eyes had held dismissal, irritation, sometimes embarrassment. Now there was something else. Confusion. As if he had just realized he had been looking at a stranger all along. "How long?" he asked quietly. The room had settled again. Even the reporters in back had stopped scribbling. I met his gaze. "How long what? How long have you been planning this?" There was genuine bewilderment in his voice. He truly believed power worked only one way through scheme's leverage calculation. He couldn't imagine another answer. I shook my head. "I wasn't planning against you, Father." "Then what were you doing?" The question carried something almost childlike. And that was what finally broke my heart. Because Harold Whitmore still didn't understand. I answered gently. I was becoming the person Granddaddy believed I already was. Something in his face shifted, a crack too deep to hide. For one fleeting second, he looked less like the man who had spent decades ruling Charleston boardrooms, and more like a lost boy standing outside his father's locked study door. Judge Carlisle cleared his throat. "Court will recess for 30 minutes while federal counsel prepares immediate asset injunction orders." The gavel struck. People began rising. Chairs scraped. Whispers erupted. The room was alive again. But my father didn't move. He simply stood there, staring at the polished wood of the plaintiff's table, his shoulders slightly bent as though the weight of 74 years had finally settled where pride could no longer hold it up. Then he whispered something so softly I almost didn't hear it. He really never trusted me. And before I could answer, Linda looked directly at him and said the words that finished what the court had begun. "I'm filing for divorce." The sound Harold made when Linda said it was not anger. Not at first. It was something softer and far more terrible. A quiet exhale as though some last invisible support inside him had finally given way. For a moment he simply stared at her. The reporters nearest the gallery doors had already lifted their phones. I could hear camera shutters beginning to click. Linda noticed too. And just like that, her panic gave way to calculation. It was almost impressive how quickly she transformed. Her shoulders straightened. Her expression settled into wounded dignity. The trembling in her hands disappeared. She looked less like a frightened woman facing federal inquiry, and more like Charleston society's tragic wronged wife preparing her public statement. If I hadn't known her so well, I might have admired it. She lifted her chin and addressed the judge in a voice smooth enough for charity galas and board luncheons. "Your Honor, I was deliberately misled regarding these transactions. Effective immediately, I will cooperate fully with all investigators and seek legal separation from Mr. Whitmore." Harold stared at her in disbelief. After 19 years of polished dinners, social climbing, and whispered reassurances in their historic South Battery home, she had abandoned him in less than 30 seconds. I suppose that was what surprised him most. Not that she would leave. That she would leave first. He gave a dry, humorless laugh. "You always were efficient." Linda didn't answer. She simply turned and walked toward the courtroom doors, heels clicking sharply across the hardwood floor each step, carrying her farther from the life she had built beside him. No backward glance, no hesitation. When the heavy doors shut behind her, the sound echoed through the chamber like the closing of a vault. And Harold Whitmore was alone. The newspapers had a field day. Charleston still pretends it's above scandal, but the city feeds on it the way old gardens feed on rain. Quietly. Constantly. The Post and Courier ran the headline the next morning. "Whitmore fortune frozen in federal trust shakeup." By noon, local television stations were replaying footage of Harold leaving court under federal escort. His face looked smaller on screen somehow. Not diminished by age. Diminished by exposure. The man Charleston had spent 40 years admiring had become exactly what society fears most. Ordinary. I spent that first week in Granddaddy's old office on Meeting Street, reviewing records with Auditor Dorsey and a team of forensic accountants. The office hadn't changed much since Samuel's death. Same dark oak shelves, same brass reading lamp, same faint smell of old leather and pipe tobacco trapped deep in the walls. Sitting behind his desk felt strange at first, like wearing someone else's coat. Too heavy, too large. But gradually something settled into place. Not ownership. Responsibility. That was what Granddaddy had intended all along. Auditor Dorsey stood by the window one evening reviewing spreadsheets while Charleston's harbor lights flickered beyond the glass. "We've confirmed over 11 million in concealed exposure," she said. I rubbed my eyes. "Can the company survive?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at me carefully. "With the right leadership, yes." I almost laughed. Leadership. It sounded absurd attached to me. A part-time librarian living in a 600-square-foot apartment above a hardware store. A widow who clipped coupons and drove a 10-year-old Honda Civic with a dented rear bumper. I must have smiled at the irony because Dorsey tilted her head. "What? I don't look like anyone's idea of corporate leadership." She gave me a long measuring look. Then she said something I never forgot. "The people most suited to power are usually the ones least interested in possessing it." It sounded exactly like something Granddaddy would have said. And somehow hearing it from a federal auditor with tired eyes and practical shoes made it even truer. The first time I addressed the Whitmore Holdings staff, nearly 300 employees filled the main production floor of Plant Number 3. The same mill Granddaddy had taken me to as a little girl. The same thunder of machinery, the same scent of cotton and oil. Most of the workers looked wary. They had spent years under Harold's polished promises and aggressive expansion speeches. They expected another executive performance. Instead, I stood on the loading platform in my plain gray blazer and told them the truth. The company is carrying serious hidden debt. A murmur rippled through the room. I let it settle. Then I continued. There will be changes. Executive bonuses are suspended immediately. Luxury development exposure is being liquidated. Debt restructuring begins next week. A few grim faces nodded. They had heard enough corporate language to know layoffs usually followed. I took a breath. No hourly workers will lose pension protection under my authority. The room stilled. Several people looked up sharply. An older machinist near the front folded his arms. "How can you promise that?" His name tag read Earl Harrison. And suddenly I remembered him. The same Earl Granddaddy had greeted by name 40 years earlier. I smiled. "Because your wife had bypass surgery in 1986, and Granddaddy personally covered your deductible after your insurance denied the claim." Earl's expression changed. "You remember that?" I remember him remembering. Silence. Then Earl gave one slow nod. That nod changed everything. Trust doesn't arrive with applause. It arrives quietly, one honest recognition at a time. By the end of the meeting, people were listening differently. Not to a Whitmore heir. To a steward. Exactly as Granddaddy intended. Harold, meanwhile, moved into a modest assisted living apartment on the west side of Charleston. Not because he was infirm. Because nearly every account he controlled had been frozen pending review, and the South Battery house was under temporary trust possession. Charleston's social circles moved on quickly. The invitations stopped. The golf club board regretfully accepted his resignation. Friends he'd entertained for decades suddenly discovered scheduling conflicts. That's another thing age teaches, I suppose. Some relationships are simply transactions wearing smiles. He had built his entire life among people who loved status more than substance. Once status vanished, so did they. The irony would have amused Granddaddy, if it weren't so sad. I arranged anonymous monthly payments to cover Harold's apartment. Nothing extravagant, just enough. When Auditor Dorsey discovered it, she frowned. What? I looked out the office window toward Charleston Harbor, where evening sunlight scattered gold across the water. Because he's still my father. She studied me for a moment, then nodded once. No judgment, just understanding. I thought that would be the end of it. A quiet mercy he'd never know about. But 3 months later, my office phone rang just after lunch. I answered absently, still reviewing pension restructuring proposals. A long silence greeted me. Then Harold's voice came softly across the line. Why are you paying my rent? My chest tightened. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he said something I had never once heard from him in 46 years. I need to see you. And for reasons I couldn't quite explain. I said yes. I drove to his apartment on a Thursday afternoon in late October. Charleston was caught in that brief, perfect season when the summer heat finally loosens its grip and the city remembers how to breathe. The oak trees along Broad Street still held most of their leaves, their branches draped in Spanish moss that shifted softly in the breeze like old lace curtains. I parked my Honda in front of the assisted living complex and sat for a moment with both hands resting on the steering wheel. The building itself was clean but unremarkable. 3 stories of beige brick and white trim tucked beside a Methodist church and a small pharmacy. Nothing like the South Battery mansion Harold had ruled for nearly 2 decades. No wrought iron balconies. No harbor view. No gleaming black town car waiting by the curb. Just a quiet, ordinary place where old men played checkers in the lobby and women tended potted geraniums near the entrance. For some reason that comforted me. Pride has trouble breathing in ordinary places. I found his apartment on the 2nd floor. Unit 214. The brass numbers were slightly crooked. I stood there longer than necessary, my hand hovering over the door. 46 years of complicated history can gather itself into a single knock. When I finally raised my hand, the sound felt louder than it should have. A few seconds later, the door opened, and for a moment I didn't recognize him. Not because age had changed him. Age had always touched him lightly. Even at 74, Harold Whitmore still carried traces of the broad-shouldered man Charleston once admired. What startled me was the absence of performance. He wore a plain blue cardigan over a white undershirt and khaki slacks that had clearly not been pressed. His silver hair was thinner than I remembered. He had missed a spot shaving near his jaw. There was no polished smile, no executive confidence, no carefully arranged posture designed to command a room. He simply looked like an old man who had answered his own door. And somehow that made my throat tighten. "Hello, Evelyn." His voice was quieter, too. I nodded. "Hello, Father." He stepped aside. The apartment was modest but tidy. A narrow sofa faced a television that wasn't turned on. A bookshelf stood against one wall, half filled with biographies and financial magazines. A small dining table held 2 coffee cups and a plate of untouched sugar cookies. The curtains were open. Late afternoon sunlight spilled across the carpet in long golden bars. He had prepared for my visit. That realization hurt more than I expected. He motioned toward the sofa. "Would you like coffee?" I almost smiled. For as long as I could remember, Harold Whitmore had never made his own coffee. "Yes," I said. He disappeared into the kitchenette. I could hear the awkward clatter of ceramic cups, the hiss of an inexpensive drip machine. When he returned, he handed me a mug and sat carefully across from me. For a while, neither of us spoke. We simply held our coffee and listened to the faint sounds of traffic outside. Then he looked down at his hands and said very quietly, "You always took it black." I blinked. The comment was so small, so unexpectedly observant that for a second I didn't know how to answer. "Yes." He nodded faintly. Another silence. Then he said the words I had stopped expecting years ago. "I'm sorry." The air seemed to shift around us. I had imagined hearing those words countless times over the years. Sometimes in anger. Sometimes in triumph. Sometimes in dreams so vivid they left me aching after I woke. But now that they had finally arrived, they didn't feel dramatic. They felt fragile, like something too easily broken by the wrong response. I set my coffee down carefully. "For what?" He gave a sad little laugh. "That's a fair question." His hands folded together, fingers trembling slightly. Then he looked at me directly. And for the first time in my life, Harold Whitmore spoke to me without armor. When your mother died, he said I didn't know how to be anyone else. I frowned. He stared at the floor. My entire life was spent trying to earn your grandfather's respect. Every promotion, every expansion, every public success, I thought eventually he would look at me and say, I was enough. His voice caught, but he never did. I thought of Granddaddy's steady eyes, his quiet standards, his belief that character mattered more than applause. And suddenly I understood something I had never allowed myself to consider. Samuel hadn't withheld love from Harold. He had withheld approval Harold believed he was owed. There's a difference, a painful one. Father rubbed his thumb across his palm the way nervous men do. When he trusted you instead of me? He swallowed hard. I couldn't bear it. The confession hung between us. Simple, ugly, honest. So much damage born from one wounded son's hunger to be chosen. I told myself you were weak because admitting otherwise meant admitting why he trusted you. He looked up, his eyes wet now. And then Michael got sick. I felt my chest tighten. His voice dropped lower. You loved him the way your mother loved me. Completely, without bargaining for worth. He shook his head. I envied that. The room blurred slightly as tears gathered in my eyes. For years I had carried my own bitterness like polished stone, heavy but familiar. Now sitting across from this smaller, broken version of my father, I felt it begin to loosen. Not vanish, but soften. I drew a slow breath. When Michael died, I said quietly, I thought losing him meant losing the only person who ever really saw me. Father's face crumpled. And then something extraordinary happened. Harold Whitmore began to cry. Not politely, not with restrained dignity. He wept openly, shoulders shaking, all the carefully controlled grief of a lifetime breaking loose in that small beige apartment. I moved before thinking, crossed the space between us, and sat beside him. For a moment neither of us knew what to do. Then his hand found mine. Small things can heal what grand gestures never touch. We sat like that for a long time. Two grieving people at last honest enough to mourn what pride had stolen. Eventually his breathing steadied. He wiped his face and stared out the window at the fading Charleston light. I thought success meant never needing anyone, he whispered. I squeezed his hand gently. No, I said. It means becoming someone safe enough to be needed. He turned to me slowly. And there, for the first time in 46 years, I saw it. Not judgment. Not disappointment. Not calculation. Recognition. As if he were finally seeing the daughter who had been standing in front of him all along. His voice was barely audible. Your grandfather chose wisely. And for the first time since I was a little girl, I believed he meant it. A year later, Charleston looked the same. That was the funny thing about old southern cities. They know how to keep their face composed while everything underneath quietly changes. The church bells still rang across Broad Street on Sunday mornings. Tourists still wandered the Battery taking photographs of historic homes they could never afford. The harbor still caught the evening sun and scattered it across the water like handfuls of broken gold. From the outside, Whitmore Holdings still looked like what it had always been. Old money wrapped in brick and ivy. But inside everything was different. The luxury coastal developments Harold had hidden so carefully were gone. Liquidated. The debt had been restructured without sacrificing a single worker pension. Executive compensation was capped. Board seats were opened to employee representation for the first time in company history. And most importantly, the company had begun doing what Granddaddy always believed business was meant to do: serve people instead of consuming them. Plant number 3 had reopened 2 modernized production lines. Scholarship funds had been established for workers' children and grandchildren. Charleston County libraries, some of which had struggled for years under shrinking public budgets, received permanent educational grants through the Samuel Whitmore Foundation. That part meant the most to me. There is something deeply satisfying about seeing children walk into libraries your family once helped build, and knowing those doors will remain open long after your own life is finished. Legacy should sound like turning pages, not applause. The dedication ceremony for the Samuel Whitmore Education Center was held on a cool November afternoon beneath a bright blue sky. The new building stood beside plant number 3, its clean red brick designed to match the historic mill beside it. Workers and their families filled the courtyard. Children chased each other between folding chairs while older employees shook hands and traded stories about Granddaddy. Earl Harrison stood near the front in his best suit, his wife beside him. When he saw me, he smiled and tipped his head. That small gesture still meant more to me than any boardroom vote ever could. I had just stepped toward the podium when I saw him. Harold. He stood near the back of the crowd wearing a plain charcoal suit that had clearly been altered down from better years. He looked thinner now, frail in a way he hadn't been even 12 months earlier. Age had finally caught him, perhaps because pride was no longer there to hold it at bay. For a second, neither of us moved. Then he gave me a small nod and smiled. It was not Harold Whitmore's old public smile, the polished one he wore for donors and photographers and investors. This one was quieter, uncertain, real. I smiled back. When my speech ended, there was warm applause. Not extravagant, not performative. The kind that comes from shared gratitude rather than obligation. Then, as planned, I invited Harold to the podium. A murmur moved through the crowd. Charleston still remembered scandal. People weren't sure what to expect. Neither, I suspect, was he. He walked slowly to the microphone and stood there for several seconds, looking out at the gathered families, at the children laughing near the library doors, at the workers whose pensions had survived his mistakes, at the company his father built and his daughter had saved. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough but steady. My father spent his life teaching a lesson I refused to learn. The courtyard fell silent. Harold glanced toward me, then back to the crowd. For most of my life, I believed success meant being admired. He paused. I was wrong. The wind stirred gently through the oak trees. He drew a breath. My daughter saved what I nearly destroyed because she understood something I never did. His eyes found mine again. And then he said the words I had waited half a lifetime to hear. She became the person I should have been. No one moved. No one whispered. The truth has a way of quieting everything around it. Then Earl Harrison began to clap. Slowly. Once. Twice. Then the entire courtyard joined him. Not for redemption. Not for status. For honesty. For the simple courage of finally telling the truth. When Harold stepped down, his eyes were wet. He took his seat in the front row and sat quietly through the remainder of the ceremony, one hand resting on the polished wood of his cane. Later, after the crowd had thinned and evening light stretched long across the courtyard, we sat together on a bench outside the library. Children's laughter drifted faintly from inside. The building glowed warmly through its tall windows. Harold looked at it for a long time. Then he said softly, "He would have liked this." I smiled. Yes. Another silence settled between us. But this one was peaceful. The kind of silence built from understanding instead of distance. After a while, he turned to me. "Do you think he forgave me?" I thought carefully before answering. Then I said the only honest thing I knew. "I think he always hoped you'd forgive yourself." Harold's eyes filled again. He nodded slowly and looked back toward the library. And there, beneath the fading Charleston sky with children reading inside a building built from second chances, I finally understood what my grandfather had spent his whole life trying to teach us. Wealth is not what we keep. It is what we protect for others. Pride builds empires that collapse. Character builds legacies that endure. And sometimes the truest form of revenge is not destruction. It is becoming someone kind enough to forgive. If this story stirred something in your own heart, if it reminded you of someone you've needed to forgive, or someone whose forgiveness you still hope to earn, perhaps tonight is the night to reach for that peace. And if stories like this speak to the quiet truths life teaches us with age, I hope you'll share this one with someone who might need it, and join us again. Because sometimes the stories worth hearing most are the ones that help us come home to ourselves. The champagne glass shattered so hard against the hardwood floor that the entire ballroom-style patio went silent. Not quiet, silent. The kind of silence that only happens when something deeply unexpected cracks the air wide open. A second earlier, my cousin Rick had been laughing so hard he nearly spilled barbecue sauce on his white polo shirt. "Let me guess," he snorted loudly enough for half the party to hear. "They called you Princess." I'd taken a slow sip of iced tea before answering. Hades. That was it, just one word. But the retired Navy SEAL standing near the outdoor bar dropped his champagne glass like he'd seen a ghost. The old man stared at me with pale blue eyes that suddenly looked 20 years younger and 20 years more afraid. "No," he whispered. Then he stood up straight and saluted me, right there in front of my entire family. That was the moment my cousin realized he'd made a terrible mistake. The barbecue was supposed to be simple. Just one afternoon. My Aunt Donna's 75th birthday party out near Waco, Texas. Nothing fancy, folding chairs, country music drifting from old speakers, men arguing about football beside smokers full of brisket, grandkids running around with popsicles melting down their wrists. Real American family stuff. I almost didn't come. Truthfully, I hadn't attended one of these gatherings in nearly 8 years. Families remember things, especially the embarrassing things. And in my family, I was mostly remembered as the strange one, the quiet one, the woman who disappeared into the army and never really came back. Most of them assumed I had worked some forgettable desk job pushing paperwork around military offices. I never corrected them. It was easier that way. At 53 years old, I'd learned something most people only understand after enough funerals: peace matters more than recognition. Still, Aunt Donna had called personally. "Claire," she'd said softly over the phone, "I'm getting old, sweetheart. I'd really love to see you." So I drove the 3 hours. I brought peach cobbler. And I promised myself I'd leave before sunset if Rick started drinking too much. Unfortunately, Rick started drinking before noon. My cousin had always been loud in the way insecure men usually are. He wasn't evil, just arrogant. The type who believed volume was the same thing as confidence. He sold RVs outside Dallas and treated every conversation like he was trying to win Employee of the Month. By the time I arrived, he was already working through imported beer and holding court near the grill. "Well, look who finally came back from Area 51, he barked when he saw me. A few people laughed. I smiled politely. "You still alive, Rick?" "Barely. Inflation's trying to kill me." That got another round of laughter. I hugged Aunt Donna, kissed her cheek, helped carry trays from the kitchen to the patio while everyone else sat around debating politics and gas prices. Nobody noticed. I preferred it that way. Around 4 o'clock, a black SUV rolled into the driveway. Out stepped an older man wearing a navy blazer despite the Texas heat. Tall, lean, white hair cut military short. Even before Aunt Donna introduced him, I recognized the posture. Combat veterans carry themselves differently. Doesn't matter how old they get. "This is Walter Briggs," Aunt Donna announced proudly. "He served with Harold years ago." Harold had been her late husband. Walter shook hands around the patio until his eyes landed on me. For a split second, something changed in his expression. Recognition, then confusion, then uncertainty. I looked away first. I should have known right then the day was about to go sideways. By early evening, Rick had moved from annoying to obnoxious. He'd gathered a small audience around the patio cooler and started telling stories about his high school football days like he'd almost made the NFL. I was sitting quietly near the railing, watching sunlight settle over the fields beyond Aunt Donna's property, when Rick wandered over holding a beer. So he said loudly, "You ever actually do anything dangerous in the army?" I shrugged. "Sometimes." "What's that mean?" "It means sometimes." A few cousins chuckled. Rick grinned wider. "You shoot guns and all that?" "Occasionally." "Fight anybody?" His tone had that teasing edge men use when they think they're cornering someone. I could feel Walter Briggs watching from across the patio. I should have shut the conversation down. Instead, maybe because I was tired. Or maybe because after 20 years I was exhausted, pretending to be smaller than I was. I answered honestly. "Only hand to hand," I said calmly. Knives were optional. The entire group burst out laughing. Rick slapped the table. "Oh, come on." I smiled into my tea glass. Then came the line. "Let me guess." He laughed. "They called you princess." I looked him directly in the eye. Hades. The champagne glass shattered 1 second later. Walter Briggs had gone completely pale. Not shocked pale, haunted pale. The old SEAL stared at me like he was looking straight through 20 years of buried memories. "No damn way," he whispered. Rick blinked. "What?" Walter slowly approached me. "You were Task Unit 7, he said quietly. I didn't answer. "You flew Kandahar extraction routes." Still silent. Walter's breathing changed. My family looked back and forth between us, confused. Rick forced out a laugh. "Okay, hold on, what's happening?" Walter ignored him completely. He looked at me the way soldiers look at graves. "I heard you were dead." The patio had gone still except for distant cicadas buzzing in the trees. I set my glass down carefully. "Not dead," I said softly. Walter's eyes glistened slightly. "My God," he whispered. "Hades." Then in front of my entire family, the retired Navy SEAL straightened his back and saluted me. And for the first time in my life, my cousin stopped laughing. Nobody spoke for several seconds after Walter Briggs saluted me. Not even Rick. And trust me, getting Rick Donnelly to stop talking was impressive enough to qualify as a small miracle. The Texas evening breeze moved softly through the oak trees around Aunt Donna's property while everybody stared at me like I'd suddenly grown another head. I hated attention. Always had. That surprise people felt when they discovered who I used to be. It never felt satisfying the way movies make it seem. Mostly it just made me tired. Rick finally forced out an awkward laugh. "Okay," he said, glancing around nervously. "What exactly is going on here?" Walter didn't answer immediately. The old seal kept staring at me with the kind of expression veterans only wear around certain names, certain memories. Finally, he looked at Rick. You got any idea who your cousin is? Rick smirked weakly. Apparently not. Walter nodded slowly. No, he said. Apparently not. Aunt Donna looked deeply confused now. Claire, she asked carefully, what is he talking about? I sighed softly and leaned back in my chair. Nothing important. Walter immediately shook his head. With respect, he said that's not true. I could feel every pair of eyes on me now. My younger cousins had stopped chasing their kids around the yard. Even the country music humming from the speakers suddenly seemed too loud. I hated this. For 20 years I'd worked very hard to become invisible. And invisibility is hard-earned, especially after war. Walter finally pulled out a chair and sat across from me. You really disappeared, he murmured. I meant to. He gave a quiet laugh through his nose. Hell, people talked about you like a ghost story. Rick folded his arms. Okay, somebody better start explaining. Walter glanced toward him. You ever hear soldiers talk about call signs? Sure. Well, Walter said carefully, most call signs are jokes, nicknames, dumb stories. He pointed toward me. Not that one. Rick looked at me, then back at Walter. You're serious? Walter's eyes never left mine. Son, there were Rangers, SEALs, Marines, pilots, men who owed their lives to her. The patio fell silent again. I could almost hear people mentally replaying every assumption they'd ever made about me. The weird cousin, the quiet loner, the unmarried woman who lived alone outside Temple with her old truck and vegetable garden. Funny how people build entire stories around silence. Rick scoffed lightly, trying to recover. Come on, he said, you're acting like she was Rambo. Walter's expression hardened instantly. No, he said quietly. Rambo was fiction. That shut Rick up. Aunt Donna slowly sat beside me. Claire, sweetheart, what did you do in the army? I looked down at my hands for a moment. At my age, your hands tell stories before your mouth does. Scars, burn marks, old fractures. I flew medevac support, I said simply. Walter corrected me immediately. You flew black zone extraction. I closed my eyes briefly. Still hated hearing those words. Most civilians have no idea what military pilots actually do in war zones. They imagine movies, flags, hero speeches. Real war is usually exhaustion mixed with terror. And helicopters, God. Helicopters are where fear becomes physical. You feel every vibration in your bones. Every sound matters. Every second matters. Walter leaned back slowly. Kandahar, he murmured. Fall of 2003. I said nothing. Rick frowned. What happened in Kandahar? Walter looked toward the darkening fields beyond the patio. The mission went bad. His voice had changed now. Quieter. Older. There was a SEAL recon unit trapped after an ambush outside the city. Sandstorm rolling in. Visibility collapsing. Enemy fighters everywhere. Several relatives were completely still now, Walter continued. Command told air support to back off. He looked directly at me. But one pilot ignored the order. I stared at my untouched tea. That wasn't bravery, I said quietly. It was anger. Walter shook his head. No, he replied. It was courage. I almost laughed at that. People who survive war often get called courageous by people who never saw how much fear was involved. Truth is, courage usually feels ugly, messy, desperate. Rick still looked unconvinced. So what? She rescued some soldiers. Walter turned toward him slowly. Son, he said, those men were already considered dead. That landed differently. Even Rick felt it. Walter pointed gently toward me. She flew into a sandstorm nobody else would touch. My throat tightened slightly. I still remembered the radio static, the screaming alarms, the taste of blood where I'd bitten through my lip. Some memories never fade. They just get quieter with age, Walter continued. The helicopter got hit twice. Aunt Donna gasped softly. But she still landed. Nobody spoke. Even the little kids nearby seemed to sense something heavy in the air. Rick cleared his throat. Well, if all this is true, why haven't we ever heard about it? That answer came easily. Because I didn't want you to. Everyone looked at me again. I finally lifted my eyes. You know what happens after enough war? I asked quietly. Nobody answered. You stop wanting attention. The breeze shifted across the patio. Somewhere down the road a dog barked. Very normal sounds. That's the strange thing about life-changing moments. The world keeps moving anyway. Walter studied me carefully. You still blame yourself. I gave him a tired smile. Occupational hazard. He leaned forward. You saved 31 men. Not all of them. Walter's face darkened slightly. No, he admitted quietly. That old ache moved through my chest again. Not sharp anymore. Just familiar. Aunt Donna reached over and gently touched my arm. Oh, Claire. I looked away. I'd spent decades making sure nobody pitied me. Pity was dangerous. Once people start feeling sorry for veterans, they stop seeing them as human beings. They either turn you into a hero or a tragedy. Neither one feels real. Rick suddenly shifted awkwardly beside the cooler. So, he rubbed the back of his neck. Why'd they call you Hades? Walter answered before I could. Because no matter how bad the situation got, he paused. She always went into hell to bring people home. Nobody laughed after that. Not one person. The sun had nearly disappeared now, painting the Texas sky orange and purple beyond the trees. Walter kept staring at me with unsettled eyes. Then his expression changed. Not admiration this time. Concern. Deep concern. Claire, he said carefully, why did you disappear after Kandahar? My stomach tightened instantly. There it was. The question I'd spent 20 years outrunning. Around us, the party noises faded into uneasy silence, because the truth was, Kandahar wasn't the reason I vanished. It was what happened after. The air changed after Walter asked that question. Even the breeze across Aunt Donna's patio seemed to slow down. Why did you disappear after Kandahar? Nobody touched their food anymore. Rick lowered his beer. My younger cousins looked confused and uncomfortable, like they were suddenly realizing the strange older woman at family cookouts had lived an entire life. None of them understood. I stared out across the dark Texas fields for several long seconds before answering. Because some things follow you home, I said quietly. Walter's face tightened. He already knew, at least part of it. But my family didn't. And once certain stories are spoken out loud, you can't put them back into silence. I folded my hands together slowly. Kandahar wasn't supposed to become a rescue mission, I began. The memories came back sharper than I wanted. Funny how trauma works. You can forget birthdays, phone numbers, names. But fear stays preserved like glass. It started as a routine extraction support operation, I continued. Small recon unit, in and out before sunrise. Walter nodded once. The sandstorm hit early, he added quietly. Yeah. I could still remember the sky turning orange-black over Afghanistan. One moment visibility was manageable. The next moment it looked like the world itself was collapsing. We lost communications twice, I said. Then the recon team got ambushed moving toward the extraction point. Rick shifted in his chair. What kind of ambush? The kind where people stop coming home. That shut him up again. I leaned back slowly. The enemy already knew where they were headed. Heavy gunfire, RPGs, 2 men down immediately. Aunt Donna pressed a hand against her chest. Oh my lord. I kept going because stopping would have been worse. The command channel ordered all air units to withdraw. Walter looked down at the table. Nobody liked that part. Especially veterans. Because sometimes war isn't about bravery. Sometimes it's about watching institutions protect themselves first. The storm was getting worse, I continued. One pilot turned back. Then another. And you didn't, Walter said softly. I shook my head. No. Rick frowned. Why not? I looked directly at him. Because they were still alive. Simple as that. The room stayed quiet. Older Americans understand something younger people often don't. When you've lived long enough, the plain truths usually hit the hardest. I closed my eyes briefly. I remember hearing one of the SEALs over the radio, I said. Could barely understand him through the static. Walter's jaw tightened. He was praying, he muttered. Yeah. I swallowed carefully. He thought nobody was coming. The patio had become so silent I could hear insects humming beyond the fence line. I flew blind for most of the final approach, I said. Couldn't see terrain, couldn't see enemy movement, could barely see my own instrument panel. Rick looked genuinely unsettled now. And you still landed. Hardest landing of my life. The old memories moved through me again. Rotor vibration, dust choking the cockpit, warning alarms screaming. Then the gunfire. God, the gunfire. Bullets tore through the left side before we even touched ground, I said quietly. Aunt Donna covered her mouth. Walter looked exhausted just hearing it again. The SEAL team was already carrying wounded when I landed, I continued. One man missing part of his leg, another barely conscious. Rick whispered Jesus. I ignored the sympathy in his voice. I wasn't interested in sympathy anymore. Not after all these years. We loaded everybody we could, I said. Then another RPG hit nearby. Walter nodded grimly. That's when the fire started. Yeah. The smell returned instantly in my mind. Burning hydraulic fluid. Burned metal. Burned flesh. Some smells never leave you. Rick stared at me differently now. Not mockingly. Not confidently. Just uncertain. So how'd you get out? I almost smiled. That's the part people usually call heroic. Walter looked at me carefully. But you don't. No. I rubbed my thumb slowly across an old scar on my palm. Heroic means you had choices, I said. Most of us didn't. The truth settled heavily over the patio. I continued quietly. We lifted off overloaded and half-blind in the middle of the storm, Walter added softly, with enemy vehicles closing in. Yeah. A younger cousin near the patio door whispered, "This sounds like a movie." I shook my head immediately. "No," I said firmly, "movies end clean." That line stayed hanging in the warm night air. Because this part wasn't clean, not even close. "The mission report blamed mechanical failure," I said eventually. Rick frowned. "But that wasn't true." "No." Walter exhaled slowly through his nose. "Here it came. The ugliest part." "The commanding officer in charge of the operation panicked," I said quietly. "He ordered everybody to retreat before the ground team was secured." Aunt Donna looked confused. "But if they left, those soldiers would have died." "They almost did." Walter's voice turned cold. "He abandoned them." I nodded once. "But after we got back, politics started." Rick blinked. "Politics." I laughed softly without humor. "Military careers, public image, command reputation." The bitterness in my own voice surprised me. Maybe because I spent years pretending it was gone. "The officer responsible had powerful connections," I continued. "And somebody needed to absorb the blame for the operation falling apart." Rick stared at me. "You?" "Me." Nobody moved. Nobody even touched their drinks. "They said I acted recklessly," I said. "Said I violated withdrawal orders, said I endangered military assets." Walter slammed his palm softly against the table. "You saved lives. Didn't matter." The old SEAL shook his head with visible anger. "I tried fighting it." "I know. But the brass buried everything." "Yeah." The bitterness in Walter's eyes told me he'd carried this anger almost as long as I had. Rick spoke carefully now. "So they punished you for rescuing people?" I looked at him calmly. "No," I said. "They punished me for embarrassing somebody important." That hit him harder than the war stories. Because Americans over a certain age understand institutions, understand pride, understand cowardice wearing expensive uniforms. I leaned back slowly. After that, things collapsed fast. My throat tightened slightly. My marriage fell apart. I couldn't sleep, couldn't be around crowds. Every helicopter sound sent my heart racing. Walter lowered his eyes. "I heard about the divorce." "Yeah." I gave a faint shrug. He said the war got more of me than he ever had. Nobody knew how to respond to that. Because what do you say? Some losses happen slowly, quietly, like rust. Rick looked down at his beer for a long moment before finally speaking. "So all these years," I finished the sentence for him. "You thought I was just some weird old woman who hated family parties." His face flushed slightly. "I mean, kinda." I actually smiled a little. "At least you're honest." The tension loosened for one brief second. Then Walter spoke again, and the warmth vanished immediately. "The officer who buried the truth," he said quietly. "He's here in Texas tomorrow." My stomach dropped. I already knew the name before he said it. "Daniel Mercer," Walter muttered darkly. "Retired general now." I stared at him. Walter's expression hardened. "He's the guest speaker at the Veterans Fundraiser in Austin tomorrow night." The old memories turned cold inside my chest. Because after 20 years, the man who destroyed my life was suddenly 1 hour down the highway. I didn't sleep much that night, not because I was afraid of seeing Daniel Mercer again. At my age, fear changes shape. When you're young, you fear bullets and failure and embarrassment. When you're older, you fear memories. I spent most of the night sitting on the back porch of my small house outside Temple, Texas, listening to crickets and staring into darkness while old sounds returned. Rotor blades, radio static, men screaming coordinates through gunfire. By morning, my chest already felt tired. At around 10, Walter Briggs called. "You going tonight?" he asked. "No." "You should. I spent 20 years avoiding men like Mercer." Walter was quiet for a second. "Claire," he said carefully, "sometimes avoiding pain also means avoiding closure." I hated when old veterans got philosophical before noon. "I'm not looking for closure. What are you looking for?" That question lingered longer than I expected. Finally, I answered honestly, "Peace." Walter sighed softly. "Then maybe it's time." By 6:30 that evening, I was standing outside the Austin Veterans Memorial Center wondering why I'd ignored my own instincts. The parking lot was full. Luxury SUVs, pickup trucks, American flags mounted near the entrance. Inside, donors and retired officers mingled beneath warm chandelier lighting, while waiters carried trays of wine and shrimp cocktails. The room smelled like expensive cologne and polished wood. The kind of place where people honored sacrifice comfortably. Walter met me near the entrance. "You came." Still deciding if that was smart. He gave me a faint smile. "You look nervous." "I'm considering assaulting an elderly general." That actually made him laugh. For a moment I almost relaxed. Then I saw Daniel Mercer. and suddenly it felt like Afghanistan had reached through 20 years to grab me by the throat. Mercer stood near the ballroom stage, surrounded by donors and local politicians. Tall, silver-haired, perfect posture, the kind of man America trusted instantly. He wore confidence like another military decoration. People shook his hand constantly. Veterans thanked him for his service. A younger reporter hovered nearby with a camera crew. Walter noticed my expression.
You okay?
No. Mercer turned slightly while laughing at something someone said. Then he saw me. His smile disappeared immediately. Not confusion. Recognition. Instant recognition. And underneath it, fear. Tiny, fast, but real. The general excused himself from the group and slowly walked toward us. Walter straightened beside me automatically. Old instincts. Mercer stopped a few feet away. Claire Donovan, he said calmly. His voice sounded exactly the same. That bothered me more than it should have. General Mercer. The title tasted bitter. His eyes scanned me carefully. You look well. That makes one of us. Walter coughed softly to hide a laugh. Mercer ignored him. I heard you left Texas years ago. I heard you rewrote history. That landed harder. The air between us tightened immediately. Mercer's polished smile returned, but thinner now. Still angry, I see. I stared directly into his eyes. Still lying, I see. Walter shifted slightly beside me. People nearby had begun noticing the tension. Mercer lowered his voice. This isn't the place. No, I replied softly. You made sure of that 20 years ago. The ballroom lights dimmed shortly afterward as guests moved toward their tables. Walter and I sat near the back. I would have left already if pride hadn't kept me planted in that chair. That's the ugly truth nobody admits. Sometimes revenge begins simply because you're tired of swallowing humiliation. An announcer stepped onto the stage. Tonight, he said warmly, we honor leadership, courage, and lifelong service. Mercer received a standing ovation before he even touched the microphone. I stayed seated. Walter did too. Mercer began speaking smoothly about patriotism and sacrifice. The crowd loved him. Of course they did. Men like Mercer always knew exactly what America wanted to hear, especially older Americans. Duty, honor, country. He spoke beautifully. That was part of the problem. Then his eyes found me again near the back table, and everything changed. There are, Mercer said into the microphone. Unfortunately, some people who never fully adjust after war. Walter stiffened beside me. I already knew where this was going. Mercer continued calmly. Trauma affects judgment, memory, emotional stability. Several people glanced toward our table now. Coward. The old anger inside me stirred awake for the first time in years. Mercer folded his hands behind his back like a statesman. Leadership sometimes requires difficult decisions under pressure. Not everyone understands those realities. Walter muttered, son of a bitch. Mercer was doing it again. Same as before. Using polished language to bury truth. The crowd listened respectfully. Most had no idea they were watching a man defend cowardice in real time. Then Mercer smiled faintly. And sadly he added some former personnel build myths around themselves afterward. Walter slammed his hand against the table hard enough to rattle silverware. That turned heads immediately. Mercer looked directly at him, and Walter Briggs stood up. I was there. The room went completely still. Walter's old voice carried farther than I expected. Mercer's expression darkened instantly. Walter, he warned quietly. No, Walter snapped. You've talked long enough? Guests shifted uncomfortably. Nobody moved. Walter pointed toward me. That woman flew into a goddamn firestorm while you ran. The ballroom exploded into whispers. Mercer's face turned pale. You don't know what you're talking about, he said sharply. But now another voice spoke up. I do. A man near the front slowly rose from a wheelchair. Older Marine, gray beard, missing left leg. He looked toward me with wet eyes. She saved my life. Silence swallowed the room again. Then another veteran stood. Then another. A medic. A former ranger. An elderly father holding a folded military cap. One by one they spoke. She brought my son home. She carried wounded men herself. We were told nobody was coming. Mercer's confident posture finally cracked. I sat frozen while 20 years of buried truth rose into the room like smoke. Walter stepped closer to the stage. The Kandahar files were partially declassified last year, he said loudly. People can read them now. Mercer's jaw tightened. Walter's voice shook with fury. You abandoned your men. Nobody applauded now. Nobody smiled. The ballroom had become a courtroom. And for the first time in 2 decades, Daniel Mercer looked small. Then the Marine in the wheelchair slowly raised a trembling hand to his forehead and saluted me. The entire room watched in silence. Some with shock, some with shame, some with tears. And suddenly I realized something strange. After 20 years, I no longer wanted revenge. I just wanted the truth to stop hiding. The ballroom never fully recovered after that, even after the applause died away, even after people slowly returned to their seats. The mood had changed too much. Truth does that sometimes, especially old truth. It settles into a room like smoke and makes everybody breathe differently. Daniel Mercer tried finishing his speech, but the confidence was gone now. People still listened politely because Americans over 60 were raised to respect uniforms and ceremony, but you could feel the shift. Once doubt enters a room, reputation starts leaking quietly through the cracks. Mercer wrapped up 10 minutes later to scattered applause. Nothing like the standing ovation from earlier. Walter leaned toward me. You okay? I watched Mercer step away from the podium while avoiding eye contact with half the ballroom. I don't know yet. And that was the truth. I'd spent 20 years imagining what justice would feel like. Turns out, it mostly felt exhausting. The fundraiser ended shortly afterward. Clusters of veterans and donors gathered around the lobby speaking in hushed voices. Several older men approached me carefully. Not aggressively, not dramatically, just quietly. That's how older veterans usually handle respect. One retired ranger shook my hand and said, "Thank you for bringing our boys home." Another man in a Vietnam veteran cap hugged me without saying a word. A woman in her 70s pressed a folded photograph into my hand. "My son talked about you before he died," she whispered. I looked down at the picture. Young Marine, big smile, desert camouflage. My chest tightened immediately. "Oh," I whispered softly, "I remember him." And I did. That was the burden nobody explains about surviving war. You carry faces forever. The woman squeezed my hand gently. "He said you stayed calm when everybody else panicked." I almost laughed at that. I'd never felt calm once in my entire military career. But soldiers often mistake quiet fear for courage. Walter and I eventually stepped outside into the warm Austin night air. The fundraiser noise faded behind us while traffic moved steadily along the nearby highway. Texas nights always smell faintly like dust and gasoline in summer. Walter lit a cigarette despite probably being told not to by 6 different doctors. "You know this is gonna spread fast," he said. I figured. The veteran community never forgets names. I leaned against the concrete railing outside the building. "You know what's funny?" "What?" "I spent 20 years trying to disappear." Walter gave a tired smile. "And one barbecue ruined it." That actually made me laugh for real. The first real laugh in a long time. Then Walter grew serious again. "You deserved better, Claire." I stared out toward the parking lot lights. Maybe once years ago hearing that would have mattered more. But age changes your relationship with fairness. At some point you realize life rarely balances the books cleanly. "You know what I regret most?" I asked quietly. Walter shook his head. I let bitterness isolate me. The old SEAL didn't answer immediately, because he understood. Veterans are very good at isolation. We build entire lives around avoiding pain. And after enough years, loneliness starts feeling normal. By the next morning, the story had already started moving through military circles online. Walter wasn't kidding. Calls came all day. Old pilots, former medics, retired officers. People I hadn't spoken to in decades somehow found my number within hours. One man cried on the phone before saying a single word. Another simply said, "Thought you should know." We never believed the official story. That one hit harder than I expected. Because deep down I think part of me always believed I'd truly been abandoned by everybody. Turns out silence and betrayal aren't always the same thing. Around noon, Rick showed up at my house unexpectedly. I saw his truck pull into the driveway while I was watering tomato plants. He climbed out awkwardly, holding a paper bag from a local bakery. That alone told me he was nervous. Rick normally apologized with jokes, not pastries. I set the hose down. "What's in the bag?" "Peach turnovers." I nodded slowly. "That's serious, huh?" He rubbed the back of his neck. "Can I come in?" We sat at my kitchen table drinking coffee while the ceiling fan hummed overhead. Rick looked uncomfortable in the way middle-aged men do when they realize they've behaved badly. Finally he sighed. "I owe you an apology." "You do?" He nodded. "I was an ass." "Also true." That earned a weak smile. Then his face turned serious again. "I really thought you were exaggerating at the barbecue." "I know." "No," he said quietly. I thought you were lonely." That surprised me. Rick stared down into his coffee. "You always stayed away from people," he admitted. "I figured maybe you wanted attention." I leaned back slowly. "That's fair." "No," he said immediately. "It isn't." The sincerity in his voice softened something inside me. Rick looked around my small kitchen. "You've been carrying all this alone." I gave a small shrug. "For a while." He shook his head slowly. "That general..." He paused. "How does somebody live with doing that to another person?" I thought about Daniel Mercer standing on that stage pretending to be honorable. Then I answered honestly. Probably the same way the rest of us survive hard things. Rick frowned. How? By lying to ourselves carefully. 3 days later, Mercer called me personally. I almost didn't answer. But curiosity won. His voice sounded older now. Not physically older. Spiritually older? Claire, he said quietly, could we meet? Every instinct told me no. But another part of me, the tired part, wanted the story finished properly. So we met at a small diner outside Georgetown. Nothing dramatic. Just coffee and silence. Mercer looked terrible. The polished confidence was gone. Without the podium and medals, he suddenly seemed like what he truly was, an aging man carrying decades of shame. He stared at his untouched coffee for a long time before speaking. I was afraid he admitted. I said nothing. The storm hit, communications collapsed, and I panicked. There it was. Not strategy, not politics. Cowardice. Simple human cowardice. His eyes looked wet now. I kept telling myself withdrawing was tactical. He swallowed hard. But the truth is, I was terrified. I watched him carefully. This was the man I'd hated for 20 years, and suddenly he just looked tired. Broken even. Mercer rubbed his trembling hands together. You want to know something awful? I stayed silent. I hated you, he whispered. Because every time someone mentioned your name, I remembered exactly who I really was. The diner grew quiet around us. Older couples drank coffee nearby. Country music played softly overhead. Ordinary American life continuing around two damaged people. Mercer finally looked up at me. After everything I did, he asked hoarsely, why didn't you destroy me years ago? I stared at him for a very long time before answering. Because the truth was, I'd spent 20 years asking myself the exact same question. Daniel Mercer sat across from me in that little diner looking like a man who had finally run out of places to hide. Outside the windows, late afternoon sunlight stretched across the highway while pickup trucks rolled past in steady Texas traffic. Inside, a waitress refilled coffee cups and called everybody honey. Ordinary life. That's the strange thing about heavy moments. The world never pauses for them. Mercer waited for my answer. Why didn't you destroy me years ago? I looked down at my coffee for a long moment before speaking. Because hatred gets heavy, I said quietly. He blinked slowly. You carry it long enough. Eventually it carries you. The old general lowered his eyes, and for the first time since I'd known him, Daniel Mercer looked completely honest. Not polished, not commanding. Just tired. I told myself I was protecting careers, he admitted softly. Protecting the military. Protecting morale. I nodded once. That's how people survive guilt. They rename it. Mercer swallowed hard. I ruined your life. For years, hearing those words was all I thought I wanted. Some admission, some apology, some recognition. But sitting there across from him, I realized something important. Pain doesn't disappear just because somebody finally admits they caused it. It still happened. The lost years still existed. The nightmares still existed. The divorce papers, the panic attacks, the isolation, none of that magically vanished. But strangely, the anger had already started fading before this conversation even began. Mercer rubbed his hands together slowly. I don't expect forgiveness. That's good, I replied calmly, because forgiveness isn't a transaction. He nodded faintly. Then we sat quietly for a while, listening to dishes clatter behind the counter. Two old people carrying different kinds of regret. A week later, Walter invited me to a veterans support gathering in Killeen. Small room, nothing fancy. Just folding chairs, coffee, and older veterans trying to help younger ones stay afloat after service. Normally, I would have refused. For years, I avoided veteran events whenever possible. Too many ghosts in one room? But this time felt different. Maybe because something inside me had finally loosened. Maybe because after spending decades hiding from my past, I was getting tired of running from it. Walter introduced me simply. This is Claire. No dramatic speech, no medals, no war stories. Just Claire. And honestly, I appreciated that more than he probably realized. The group included young soldiers recently back from overseas, a few older Vietnam vets, one Marine missing 2 fingers, another man who barely spoke the entire evening. I recognized that silence immediately. Trauma has a sound, and sometimes the sound is nothing at all. Walter eventually asked if I'd share something. At first I didn't want to. Then I noticed one younger veteran sitting near the wall staring down at the floor exactly the way I used to after Afghanistan. That look changed my mind, so I stood slowly and spoke. I began quietly. People hear military stories and think the hardest part is combat. Several veterans nodded slightly. But for a lot of us, I continued, the hardest part comes afterward. The room stayed completely still. I spoke slowly, carefully. Not like a speech, more like a confession. You come home and everybody expects you to return to normal immediately. A few bitter laughs moved through the room. But war changes the speed of your thinking, I said. Changes how you sleep, changes how safe the world feels. The younger veteran near the wall finally looked up at me. For years I admitted I thought isolation was strength. Walter watched quietly from the back. I thought shutting people out protected me. I smiled faintly. But loneliness is sneaky. It starts feeling comfortable after a while. Several older veterans nodded hard at that one. Because they knew. God, they knew. One man finally raised his hand. Gray-haired Army veteran, probably early 70s. Can I ask something? Sure. He hesitated. Why'd they call you Hades? A few people in the room shifted curiously. I looked down at my hands before answering. For years, people assumed the call sign meant something dark, dangerous, violent. But the truth was never what they expected. The first team that gave me the name, I said softly, used it after a rescue mission went bad. The room stayed silent. I smiled gently. One of the SEALs said, I paused briefly. No matter how deep into hell we got, she always came back for us. Nobody spoke afterward. Not immediately. Because older Americans understand something younger audiences sometimes miss. The most meaningful moments usually arrive quietly. No music, no explosions. Just truth landing softly inside a room. After the meeting ended, several younger veterans stayed behind, talking longer than they probably intended. One thanked me for speaking honestly about isolation. Another admitted he hadn't talked to his own daughter in 8 months. That one hurt to hear. Before leaving, the quiet young veteran from earlier finally approached me near the coffee table. He looked nervous. You really think people can come back from that stuff? He asked. From what? He shrugged helplessly. The darkness. I studied him carefully. Then I answered the only honest way I knew how. Not completely, I said, but enough to live again. His eyes watered slightly. He nodded once. And somehow, that moment mattered more to me than every medal I'd ever received. That evening I drove home alone beneath a deep orange Texas sunset. Windows down, warm air rolling through the truck. For the first time in years, the silence around me didn't feel empty. It felt peaceful. I thought about Aunt Donna, Walter, Rick, even Daniel Mercer. Life had wounded all of us differently. Some people responded with arrogance, some with guilt, some with isolation. But underneath it all, most people were simply trying to survive themselves. When I pulled into my driveway, I sat in the truck a little longer, watching evening light settle across the fields. And I realized something. People thought Hades meant death, fear, violence. But they were wrong. It meant bringing people back from hell, including yourself. And maybe that's true for more people than we realize. Maybe some of us spend years carrying pain silently because we think nobody else would understand. Maybe pride keeps families apart longer than it should. Maybe forgiveness isn't about excusing what happened, but finally refusing to let bitterness become your final identity. If this story meant something to you, if it reminded you of someone you lost, someone you forgave, or even a part of yourself you're still trying to heal, then I hope you'll carry that feeling forward. Share it with somebody who might need it. And remember, sometimes the strongest people aren't the loudest ones in the room. Sometimes they're simply the ones who survived and chose kindness anyway. Hope you enjoy being homeless, because I made sure you get nothing. My father said it loud enough for everyone in the courtroom to hear. A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others smiled. One man near the back actually chuckled. The words hung in the air like cigarette smoke. Heavy, ugly, impossible to ignore. I stared at my father across the courtroom. William Morgan, 68 years old, owner of a successful construction company in Columbus, Ohio. A respected businessman. A church donor. A man people described as honorable. A man who had spent most of my life treating me like I was a mistake. And at that moment he looked proud. Not angry, not emotional. Proud. As though humiliating his own daughter in public was some kind of achievement. Then I laughed. Not a nervous laugh. Not a bitter laugh. A genuine laugh. The kind that escaped before I could stop it. My father's smile vanished. What's so funny? He snapped. Before I could answer, the judge looked up from the documents in front of him. His eyes settled on me. For a moment he looked confused, then curious, then strangely familiar. Wait, he said. The entire courtroom became silent. He leaned forward. You're the girl who... And suddenly every person in that room was staring at me. But to explain what happened next, I need to tell you how I got there. Because that courtroom battle didn't begin that morning. It started more than 20 years earlier. Back when I was a little girl trying desperately to earn my father's love. My name is Rachel Morgan. I'm 34 years old, and for most of my life I believed there was something wrong with me. I grew up in a modest neighborhood outside Columbus. My father built houses, my mother stayed home. My older brother Michael was 6 years ahead of me. From the outside we looked like the perfect American family. Inside the house things felt different. Michael was my father's pride. I was simply there. I noticed it before I was 10 years old. If Michael got a B on a test, Dad celebrated. If I got straight A's, Dad nodded and changed the subject. If Michael scored a touchdown, Dad invited the whole family out for dinner. If I won an academic award, he usually forgot to attend the ceremony. At first I thought I just needed to try harder. Children always assume they can earn love. So I tried. God knows I tried. I worked harder in school, helped around the house, avoided trouble, made honor roll every year. Nothing changed. One evening when I was about 13, I finally asked my mother, "Dad doesn't like me much, does he?" She looked heartbroken. For a second I thought she might tell me the truth. Instead, she smiled weakly. "Of course he loves you." I remember staring at my plate. "That's not what I asked." She never answered. That silence followed me for years. Michael didn't help. As we got older, he became increasingly like our father. Confident, entitled, certain the world revolved around him. Dad gave him opportunities I never received. A summer job at the company, a company truck, business mentoring, networking introductions. When Michael graduated college, Dad handed him a management position. No interview, no competition. Just handed it over. I worked my way through nursing school with scholarships and part-time jobs. Dad barely noticed. Then September 11th happened. Like millions of Americans, I watched the towers fall. Something changed inside me. I wanted my life to matter. I wanted to serve something bigger than myself. A year later, I joined the Army. The conversation with my father remains one of the clearest memories of my life. We sat at the kitchen table. I was 20 years old, nervous but excited. "Dad, I enlisted." He stared at me. "What?" "The Army." For several seconds he said nothing. Then he laughed. Not because he thought I was joking, because he thought I was stupid. "The Army." I nodded. "I want to serve." His face hardened. "You want to throw your life away." "I don't see it that way." "Of course you don't." That was the beginning of our longest argument. He told me I was making a mistake. I told him I had made my decision. He accused me of abandoning the family. I reminded him Michael already had the company. Eventually he stood up. "You'll regret this." I never forgot those words. Because I never did regret it. Not once. Military life wasn't easy. There were deployments, long nights, dangerous situations, friends who didn't come home. But for the first time in my life, I belonged somewhere. Nobody cared whose daughter I was. Nobody cared who my father favored. The Army measured performance, character, discipline, trust, things I could actually control. Over time, I became a combat medic, then an officer. I built a career. Built friendships, built a purpose. Meanwhile, my relationship with my father grew colder. Phone calls became rare. Visits became shorter. Every holiday felt like walking into a room where I wasn't wanted. Still, I kept trying. Because no matter how old we get, part of us remains that child waiting for a parent to finally say, "I'm proud of you." The words never came. Years passed. Then my grandfather died. Grandpa Henry was different from my father. Kind, patient, fair. He treated Michael and me equally. When I visited, he asked about my deployments, my patience, my life. He listened, actually listened. After he passed away, I was devastated. The funeral was difficult, but what happened afterward proved even worse. A few months later, my father informed me there would be an estate hearing. Nothing unusual. Families handle inheritances every day. I wasn't expecting much. Honestly, I didn't care much about the money. I attended out of respect for my grandfather. Then I arrived at the courthouse. The atmosphere felt strange immediately. Michael looked smug. My father looked confident. My mother looked nervous. The attorneys exchanged paperwork. The hearing began. One document after another was reviewed. Then came the announcement. Michael would receive nearly everything. The company shares, the investment accounts, the properties, the savings, everything. I received nothing. Not a dollar, not a keepsake. Not even my grandfather's old watch. Nothing. For a moment I simply sat there, trying to process what I'd heard. Then my father leaned toward me. A smile spread across his face. The smile of a man finally delivering a punishment he'd waited years to give. And that's when he said it. "Hope you enjoy being homeless, Because I made sure you get nothing." The room became silent. I looked at him. Then I laughed. Not because it was funny. Because suddenly something felt very wrong. Very wrong indeed. And judging by the expression forming on the judge's face, I wasn't the only one who sensed it. The courtroom remained quiet after my father's remark. I could feel dozens of eyes moving between us. Some people looked embarrassed for me. Others looked curious. Most seemed to assume they were witnessing a simple inheritance dispute. A bitter daughter. A disappointed father. Nothing unusual. The judge, however, wasn't looking at my father anymore. He was looking directly at me. His eyes narrowed, not with suspicion, with recognition. The kind of expression someone gets when they're trying to remember where they've seen a face before. He glanced down at the paperwork, then back at me, then down again. The room felt strangely still. Even my father seemed unsettled. "Your Honor," his attorney finally asked. The judge didn't answer immediately. Instead, he adjusted his glasses. "Miss Morgan," he said slowly. "Have we met before?" I blinked. "No, sir." His forehead wrinkled. "That's odd." He studied me another moment. Then he shook his head and returned his attention to the documents. The hearing resumed. But something had changed. I could feel it. The judge wasn't paying attention the same way he had before. Every few minutes he'd glance toward me again, as though trying to solve a puzzle. Meanwhile, my father sat confidently beside Michael. Neither of them noticed. Or perhaps they simply didn't care. They believed they had already won. And maybe they would have, if life hadn't taken a very unexpected turn several years earlier. A turn my family knew almost nothing about, because they never asked. Most of my military career was invisible to them. They knew I served. They knew I deployed. That was about it. Whenever I visited home, conversations rarely lasted more than a few minutes. Dad would ask when I planned to leave the Army. Michael would talk about the company. Mom would try to keep everyone polite. Then we'd all go home. No one ever asked what I had experienced overseas. No one ever asked what I had seen, or who I had become. Perhaps that's why they never learned about Afghanistan. 5 years earlier, I was serving as a combat medic attached to an army unit operating near Kandahar. It wasn't my first deployment, but it was the hardest. The region was dangerous. Roadside bombs, rocket attacks, constant uncertainty. Every day required focus. The smallest mistake could get someone killed. By then I was a captain, experienced enough to stay calm under pressure, at least most of the time. The incident that changed everything happened on an unusually hot afternoon in July. I remember the heat more than anything. The air felt thick. The dust seemed to cover everything. We had just returned from a patrol when alarms sounded across the compound. At first, nobody understood what was happening. Then the explosion hit. The blast shook the ground beneath us. Windows shattered. Smoke filled the air. People started yelling. Training took over. Everyone moved automatically. Soldiers rushed toward defensive positions. Medics rushed toward the wounded. I ran toward the explosion. Not because I was brave, because that's what medics do. When everyone else runs away from danger, we run toward it. The damaged structure was partially collapsed. Fire spread rapidly through one section. Several soldiers had been trapped inside. The situation was chaotic. People shouted conflicting information. Nobody knew exactly how many were missing. I remember reaching the building entrance. A sergeant grabbed my arm. "Captain, it's too dangerous." I pulled free. "There are still people inside." Then I went in. The smoke was overwhelming. Visibility was terrible. The heat felt like opening an oven door directly into my face. Inside, everything was confusion. Broken concrete, twisted metal, falling debris. I located the first injured soldier near a collapsed wall. He was conscious but unable to walk. I dragged him outside, then went back in, again and again. Each trip became more dangerous. The fire continued spreading. Parts of the structure were becoming unstable. Someone outside shouted that the roof might collapse. They were probably right. But there were still voices inside. I could hear them. One belonged to a young lieutenant, barely 25 years old, pinned beneath debris, terrified. I managed to reach him during my fourth entry. The situation was bad. His leg was trapped. Smoke was thickening. The ceiling groaned above us. For a moment, I honestly thought we might both die there. But somehow we got him free. I don't remember much after that. Only fragments. The weight, the heat, the exhaustion, the sound of people yelling outside when we emerged. Then darkness. I woke up 2 days later. Concussion. Smoke inhalation. Minor injuries. Nothing life-threatening. The lieutenant survived. So did several others. In total, 6 soldiers were pulled from that building. The Army conducted an investigation. Statements were collected. Reports were written. Then life moved forward. At least for me. The military later awarded me a medal for the rescue. There was a ceremony, a few photographs, some media coverage. The usual things. I never thought much about it afterward. Most veterans don't. You do your job. You move on. Besides, countless service members had done far more heroic things than I ever would. What mattered to me was simple. People came home alive. That was enough. The strange part came months later. A letter arrived. Handwritten. Unexpected. Inside was a message from the father of the young lieutenant I had helped rescue. He thanked me for saving his son. Said there were no words large enough to express his gratitude. The letter was deeply personal. Heartfelt. I kept it in a drawer. Nothing more. Life continued. Another deployment. Another assignment. Another year. Eventually, I forgot about the letter altogether. And apparently my family never knew it existed. Not that they would have cared. Back in the courtroom, the hearing entered its second hour. The attorneys continued discussing assets, property valuations, account transfers, legal language that bored everyone except the lawyers. I noticed the judge becoming increasingly distracted. At one point, he removed his glasses entirely. He stared at me, not casually, intently. Then he opened a folder, flipped through several pages, stopped. His eyes widened. A strange feeling settled into my stomach. The judge suddenly looked as though he had found something important. Very important. Slowly he raised his head. The courtroom fell silent again. My father shifted in his chair. "What is it?" Michael whispered. Nobody answered. The judge continued staring at me. For several long seconds he said nothing. Then his expression changed completely. Recognition. Absolute recognition. As if a missing piece had finally fallen into place. He leaned forward. "Miss Morgan?" I nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." His voice sounded almost disbelieving. "Your full name is Rachel Ann Morgan." "Yes, sir." He sat back slowly. A look of astonishment crossed his face. Then he whispered words that made my heart skip. Words I never expected to hear in that courtroom. Dear God. The judge stared at me, and suddenly I realized he remembered exactly who I was. Dear God. The judge's voice barely rose above a whisper. Yet somehow everyone in the courtroom heard it. The room fell completely silent. No rustling papers, no whispered conversations, no movement. Just silence. I sat frozen in my chair. The judge stared at me as though he had just seen a ghost. My father looked irritated. Michael looked confused. The attorneys exchanged puzzled glances. Finally, the judge removed his glasses. "Miss Morgan," he said carefully. "Would you please stand?" I slowly rose to my feet. Every eye in the room followed me. For a moment I wondered if I had somehow done something wrong. The judge continued studying me. Then he asked a question I never expected. "Were you serving near Kandahar 5 years ago?" My stomach tightened. "Yes, sir." A murmur moved through the courtroom. The judge nodded slowly. "And were you the Army captain who entered a burning operations building multiple times after an enemy attack?" The room became even quieter. I could actually hear the air conditioning system humming above us. I hesitated. Not because I was hiding anything. I simply hated talking about it. "Yes, sir." The judge closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them again, they looked emotional. Very emotional. My father shifted uncomfortably. "What does this have to do with anything?" he asked. The judge ignored him. Instead, he continued looking at me. "Captain Rachel Morgan. I hadn't heard anyone call me that in months. Not since leaving active service." The title sounded strange inside a probate courtroom. The judge nodded to himself. Then he turned toward the spectators, toward the attorneys, toward everyone. "I cannot believe this." My father frowned. "Your Honor." The judge finally looked at him. What happened next changed the entire atmosphere of the room. "You really don't know who your daughter is, do you?" The question hit my father like a slap. His face reddened immediately. "What is that supposed to mean?" The judge leaned back in his chair. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he looked directly at me. "I owe this woman more than I can ever repay." The room exploded into whispers. My father looked stunned. Michael looked even worse. I felt my heart begin to pound. Because suddenly I knew exactly what was happening. The letter, the young lieutenant, the father. Oh my God. The judge wasn't just someone who had heard about the rescue. He was the father. The realization hit me all at once. The courtroom seemed to shrink around me. The judge slowly stood. Nobody interrupted him. Nobody dared. My son was serving in Afghanistan 5 years ago. His voice was steady, but emotion lingered beneath every word. He was trapped inside a building after an enemy attack. Several people in the courtroom leaned forward. The judge continued. The military informed us there had been casualties. His eyes drifted toward the floor. I still remember receiving that phone call. For the first time, he sounded less like a judge and more like a father. A father remembering one of the worst days of his life. My wife and I spent hours believing our son might be dead. The courtroom remained silent. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. We later learned he survived because a combat medic repeatedly entered a burning structure to rescue trapped soldiers. He looked at me, directly at me. That medic was Captain Rachel Morgan. A collective gasp swept across the room. I heard someone whisper, "Wow." Another person muttered, "No way." My father simply stared. The confident smile he'd worn all morning had vanished completely. The judge wasn't finished. Most people never hear about acts of courage like that. His gaze moved across the room. They happen every day among the men and women who serve this country. Then he looked back at my father. But occasionally one of those stories becomes very personal. His voice softened. My son came home because of her. Nobody spoke. I felt dozens of eyes fixed on me. The attention made me uncomfortable. It always had. I wished I could disappear. But the judge continued. Captain Morgan suffered injuries during the rescue. I quietly shook my head. They weren't serious. He smiled sadly. That's exactly what my son said you would say. A few people laughed softly. The tension broke for a moment. Then the judge reached into his briefcase. He opened a worn leather folder. From inside, he removed a folded piece of paper. I recognized it immediately. A copy of the letter. The one he had written years earlier. I keep this in my office. His voice grew quieter. I read it every Veterans Day. My throat tightened. I hadn't expected that. Not at all. The judge unfolded the paper. Then he read a few lines aloud. Not many. Just enough. Enough to understand. Enough to feel the weight behind the words. A father thanking the woman who saved his son. A family expressing gratitude that could never truly be repaid. When he finished, nobody spoke. Several people looked emotional. One elderly woman in the gallery wiped her eyes. Even one of the attorneys looked uncomfortable. The kind of uncomfortable that comes from realizing you've misjudged someone. The judge folded the letter carefully. Then he turned toward my father again. What surprises me most, he said, is that this appears to be news to her family. My father swallowed. For the first time all day, he looked unsure of himself. Michael finally spoke. You never told us. I looked at him. You never asked. The words came out gently. Not angry. Not bitter. Simply true. Michael looked away. My mother lowered her head. Tears had begun forming in her eyes. I wasn't sure whether they came from pride or guilt. Perhaps both. The judge slowly returned to his seat. But before sitting down, he said something that nobody in that room would ever forget, including me. He looked directly at my father. His expression was calm, controlled. Yet there was steel beneath it, the kind of steel that comes from conviction. You may not know who your daughter is, Mr. Morgan. The room held its breath. But I do. Silence. Absolute silence. My father had spent decades building a reputation, building authority, building status. Yet in that moment he looked smaller than I had ever seen him. Not because the judge humiliated him, because the truth had. For years, Dad had viewed me as the disappointing daughter. The daughter who abandoned the family business. The daughter who chose military service over his approval. The daughter who could never measure up to Michael. Now strangers in the courtroom were looking at me with more respect than my father had shown in 20 years. And for the first time, I think he realized it. The judge glanced back down at the estate documents. His expression changed. The emotional moment was over. Now he was a judge again. Professional. Methodical. Sharp. He picked up one of the files. Flipped through several pages. Then stopped. His eyes narrowed. The room grew quiet once more. A different kind of quiet. Not emotional. Concerned. The judge examined a document. Then another. Then another. Slowly he looked toward my father's attorney. Counselor. The attorney straightened. Yes, Your Honor. The judge tapped the paperwork with one finger. His face had become unreadable. I have a question regarding these asset transfers. My father's expression changed instantly, and for the first time that day, I saw fear. Real fear. The fear appeared for only a second. Most people in the courtroom probably missed it. I didn't. When you've spent years in the military, you learn to notice tiny changes in people. A tightened jaw, a sudden shift in posture, a glance that lasts a fraction too long. Fear has a way of revealing itself, and my father was afraid. The judge held up a document. "Counselor, can you explain this transfer?" My father's attorney adjusted his glasses. "Which transfer, Your Honor?" "The Riverside property." The attorney accepted the document. His confident expression faded almost immediately. "I'll need a moment." The judge nodded. "You have one." A strange tension settled over the room. The kind that appears when something unexpected enters the conversation. Something nobody planned for. My father sat perfectly still. Too still. Michael noticed it too. "Dad." No response. "Dad." My father finally looked at him. "It's nothing." But it didn't sound like nothing. The judge continued reviewing paperwork. Several minutes passed. Then he located another document. His expression darkened further. "Interesting. Nobody liked the sound of that word, especially lawyers." The attorney cleared his throat. "Your Honor, there may be a clerical explanation." "Perhaps." The judge picked up another file. "Then maybe you can explain this one as well." The attorney accepted it. "Read it." Then frowned. I watched him carefully. Whatever he was seeing, he clearly hadn't expected it. That surprised me. Until that moment, I had assumed everyone involved knew exactly what was happening. Apparently they didn't. The judge leaned back. "Let's take a brief recess." His gavel struck. People immediately began whispering. Attorneys gathered around tables. Spectators discussed the military story they'd just heard. The atmosphere felt completely different now. The inheritance hearing had transformed into something else. Something bigger. I remained seated. I wasn't interested in gossip. I simply wanted answers. A few moments later, my mother approached. She looked older than I remembered. Smaller somehow. Fragile. "Rachel." I looked up. "Hi, Mom." Her eyes filled with tears. I didn't know. I already knew what she meant. "The rescue." She nodded. "Why didn't you tell us?" I offered a sad smile. "When would I have told you?" She opened her mouth, then closed it. Because she knew the answer. There hadn't been a moment. Not one. Over the years, our conversations had become polite exchanges about weather holidays and schedules. Nothing deeper. Nothing real. My mother sat beside me. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, she whispered something that hurt more than I expected. "I should have asked." I nodded. "Yeah." She looked down at her hands. "I should have asked a lot of things." Across the room, Michael was arguing quietly with our father. I couldn't hear the words, but I could read body language. Michael looked frustrated. Dad looked defensive. That alone felt unusual. For most of my life, Michael had followed Dad's lead without question. Now something had changed. The recess ended 15 minutes later. Everyone returned to their seats. The judge immediately resumed reviewing documents. No small talk, no delay. Straight to business. Before proceeding, he said, "I have concerns regarding several transactions connected to this estate." The room became silent again. The attorney rose. "We are prepared to address any concerns, Your Honor." "Good." The judge held up a folder. "Because I have many." A few people exchanged nervous glances. The judge began listing dates, property transfers, investment reallocations, changes to ownership records. Most sounded incredibly boring. Until he reached one specific date. A date that made my mother's face go pale. The judge noticed. "So you recognize that date?" My mother hesitated. "Yes." "What is its significance?" She looked toward my father. For a moment I thought she might remain silent, just as she had remained silent so many times before. Then something unexpected happened. She answered. "That was the week my father was hospitalized." The room grew still. The judge nodded. "Your father being Henry Lawson?" "Yes." "My grandfather." The judge continued. "Medical records indicate he was heavily medicated during that period." My father's attorney stood quickly. "Objection." "On what grounds?" The attorney hesitated. The judge waited. No answer came. Finally, the judge continued. "During that same period, multiple estate modifications were executed." The room seemed to shrink around us. I looked at my father. His face had become expressionless, but I could see the tension in his eyes. The judge wasn't accusing anyone yet. He was simply laying out facts. Yet those facts sounded increasingly troubling. Then came the moment that changed everything. The judge opened another folder. A thick one. He removed a handwritten document. "What is that?" Michael asked. Nobody answered. The judge examined the paper carefully. Then he spoke. "This appears to be an earlier version of Mr. Lawson's estate plan." My heartbeat quickened. "Earlier version?" The attorney looked confused. "I wasn't aware such a document existed." Apparently, neither were several other people. The judge began reading portions aloud. Not everything, just enough. Enough to establish a shocking fact. My grandfather's original estate plan had divided assets equally between Michael and me, 50-50. Exactly equally. The courtroom erupted. People whispered openly now. Even the attorneys looked stunned. I sat frozen, unable to process what I had heard. Equal. Grandpa had intended equal. All these years I had assumed he simply preferred Michael, just like Dad did. Apparently I had been wrong. Very wrong. My throat tightened. I suddenly remembered countless conversations with Grandpa. The way he'd always treated me fairly. The way he'd never compared me to Michael. The way he'd always listened. Of course. Of course he hadn't cut me out. He never would have. The realization hit like a punch to the chest. Across the room, Michael looked horrified. Dad! My father stared straight ahead. Not moving. Not speaking. Michael's voice shook. Dad, what is this? Still no answer. The judge folded the document, then looked directly at my father. Mr. Morgan. Nothing. Mr. Morgan. Slowly, Dad raised his eyes. The judge's voice remained calm, but firm. Can you explain why your father-in-law's original estate plan differs so dramatically from the final version? Silence. A long silence. My father opened his mouth, then closed it again. For the first time in my life, William Morgan appeared completely unprepared. The man always had answers, always had explanations, always controlled the room. Not today. The judge continued. Perhaps more importantly, he lifted another document. Can you explain why several transfers appear to benefit only one beneficiary? Michael looked stunned. Beneficiary. The judge turned a page. Your son. The color drained from Michael's face, because suddenly he realized something. This wasn't simply about me being excluded. This wasn't just favoritism. This was something far more serious. If these documents were accurate, my father hadn't merely hurt me. He may have manipulated an entire estate. An estate belonging to a dying man who trusted him. And for the first time, Michael looked at Dad not with admiration, but with doubt. The judge closed the folder. His expression was grave. I'm ordering a full review of these records. The room exploded into murmurs. My father finally spoke. That's ridiculous. The judge's gaze hardened. No, Mr. Morgan. He paused. What's ridiculous is that these questions were never asked sooner. And suddenly I understood something. The inheritance hearing wasn't ending. It was just beginning. For most of my life, my father had been the strongest man in every room. Not physically, not emotionally, but socially, financially, professionally. People listened when William Morgan spoke. Bankers respected him. Business owners sought his advice. Church leaders praised his generosity. Neighbors admired his success. My father had spent decades building a reputation. And now, for the first time, I was watching cracks form in that foundation. The court-ordered review moved quickly. Faster than I expected. The judge postponed further estate proceedings pending investigation. Within weeks, accountants began examining records. Property transactions, bank statements, estate documents, tax filings, everything. I returned to my normal life. At least I tried to. I was no longer on active duty, having recently transitioned into civilian healthcare work at a veterans medical center outside Columbus. My days were filled with patients. Men and women who had served. Many carried visible wounds. Others carried invisible ones. Working with them helped keep me grounded. The courtroom drama felt distant, until the phone calls started. First came my mother, then my attorney, then Michael. Everyone wanted to talk. Everyone suddenly wanted answers. For years, nobody had shown much interest in my life. Now, my phone wouldn't stop ringing. The irony wasn't lost on me. One afternoon, my attorney called. Rachel, I thought you'd want an update. I sat in my kitchen with a cup of coffee. Good news or bad news? A pause. Depends on how you define good. That wasn't encouraging. What did they find? More than expected. I closed my eyes. Part of me already knew. The evidence was becoming difficult to ignore. Several transactions appeared questionable. Some occurred while my grandfather was heavily medicated. Others involved sudden ownership changes. A few signatures were being examined by forensic specialists. The words made my stomach turn. Not because I was surprised. Because I wasn't. Deep down, I think I had known for years that something wasn't right. I simply never wanted to believe my father could go that far. After the call ended, I sat quietly for a long time. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt sad. Profoundly sad. Because every new discovery damaged not only my father, It damaged the entire family. A week later, the local newspaper published an article. Nothing dramatic. Just a brief report about an ongoing probate dispute involving a prominent businessman. No accusations. No conclusions. Just facts. Yet that was enough. In small communities, people notice things. Within days, rumors spread. Questions followed. Business associates became cautious. Clients grew nervous. People started talking. For the first time in decades, my father was no longer controlling the narrative. The truth was beginning to speak for itself. Then Michael showed up at my house. Unannounced. I nearly didn't recognize him. He looked exhausted. Older. Defeated. Nothing like the confident older brother I remembered. When I opened the door, he stood there awkwardly. "Can we talk?" I hesitated, then nodded. We sat at my kitchen table. The same table where I usually paid bills and sorted mail. Nothing fancy. Nothing impressive. Michael stared at his coffee. For nearly a minute. Finally he spoke. "Did you know what? That Grandpa wanted things divided equally." I shook my head. "No." His shoulders slumped. "I didn't either." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he laughed bitterly. "I spent my entire life believing I earned everything." His words carried genuine pain. Not arrogance, pain. I thought Dad trusted me more. I looked at him carefully. The realization was hitting him hard. Because favoritism hurts everyone, including the favorite, especially the favorite. It creates impossible expectations, distorted relationships, false confidence. Michael was finally seeing that. "I never asked for this," he said quietly. "I know. I honestly thought Grandpa changed his mind." "I know." He looked at me. His eyes were red. "You hate me, don't you?" The question surprised me. I thought about it honestly. Years of resentment, years of unfair treatment, years of comparisons. Then I shook my head. "No." His expression softened slightly. "I probably would." I smiled sadly. "Maybe when I was younger." We sat in silence. For the first time in our lives, we weren't competing. We weren't arguing. We weren't playing roles assigned by our father. We were simply two people trying to understand what had happened to our family. Before leaving, Michael stopped at the door. "Rachel." "Yeah, I'm sorry." The words were simple, but sincere, and somehow that mattered. A lot. A few days later, my mother called. Her voice sounded fragile. "Would you come by?" I almost said no. Almost. Instead, I drove to the house where I grew up. The same house. The same front porch. The same maple tree in the yard. Everything looked familiar, yet somehow smaller. My mother greeted me at the door. The moment I saw her face, I knew something had changed. She looked exhausted, emotionally exhausted. We sat in the living room, the room where decades of family history had unfolded. Birthdays, Christmas mornings, arguments, silences, all of it. My mother twisted a tissue in her hands. Then she finally said what she'd been carrying for years. I knew some things weren't right. I remained silent. I didn't know everything. Her voice cracked. But I knew enough. The words hurt. Not because they shocked me. Because they confirmed what I'd always suspected. "You could have said something." Tears rolled down her cheeks. "I know." "You could have defended me." "I know." "You could have stopped some of it." She lowered her head. "I know." The room fell silent. For years I had imagined this conversation. Imagined yelling. Imagined anger. Imagined confrontation. Instead, all I felt was sadness. My mother wasn't evil. She wasn't cruel. She was weak. And weakness has consequences, sometimes devastating ones. Before I left, she hugged me. For a long time. Longer than she ever had when I was young. Neither of us said much. There wasn't much left to say. Weeks turned into months. The investigation continued. Evidence accumulated. Questions multiplied. Meanwhile, my father seemed to withdraw from the world. Friends stopped calling as often. Business lunches disappeared. Community invitations slowed. People who once praised him now avoided uncomfortable conversations. Success attracts company. Scandal creates distance. One evening I drove past his office building. The parking lot was nearly empty. The lights were off. For some reason, that image stayed with me. Not because I enjoyed it. Because I didn't. The man who had spent decades chasing status was discovering how fragile status really is. Money can disappear. Reputation can collapse. Power can fade. What remains is character. And character is much harder to build. A few days later, I received another call from my attorney. The review is almost complete. I stared out my apartment window. And a long pause. Then he said something I'll never forget. Rachel, I think your father is about to lose far more than this case. After the call ended, I sat alone in the gathering darkness, thinking, not about inheritance, not about money, not about revenge. I thought about family, about choices, about consequences. And somewhere across town for perhaps the first time in his life, William Morgan was sitting alone with his own. 3 weeks after my attorney told me the investigation was nearly complete, I received a phone call I never expected. It was my father. For a moment I simply stared at the screen. William Morgan. I couldn't remember the last time he'd called me first. Usually communication happened through my mother. Or not at all. The phone rang 4 times before I answered. Hello. Silence. Then his voice, older than I remembered. Tired. Rachel. I waited. I'd like to see you. No apology. No explanation. Just those words. I leaned back in my chair. Why? Another pause. Because there are things I should have said a long time ago. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because after 20 years that statement felt absurd. There were thousands of things he should have said. Thousands. Instead, he had chosen silence. Criticism. Distance. I looked out the window. Rain tapped softly against the glass. I don't know if that's a good idea. I understand. His voice sounded defeated. Not angry. Not defensive. Defeated. Something about that unsettled me. My father had never sounded defeated before, not once. Finally, he spoke again. Please. One word. Quiet. Almost fragile. I closed my eyes. Part of me wanted to refuse. Part of me wanted to hang up. Part of me wanted to protect myself from whatever came next. But another part of me was tired. Tired of carrying old wounds. Tired of unanswered questions. Tired of wondering why. There's a Veterans Memorial Park near downtown. I knew the place. A peaceful park overlooking the river. Several monuments. Rows of engraved names. A place people visited to remember. To reflect. To grieve. Tomorrow morning. Okay, and that was it. The call ended. I barely slept that night. Not because I feared him. Because I feared disappointment. Again. The next morning was cool and overcast. The kind of Ohio morning that feels older than the calendar says. I arrived early. Old habits from military life. My father was already there, sitting on a bench near the memorial wall. For a moment I simply watched him. He looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically, spiritually. Like life had finally become heavier than he could carry. When I approached, he stood, awkwardly, almost nervously. I couldn't remember ever seeing him nervous. Thanks for coming. I nodded. Neither of us sat immediately. The silence stretched between us. 20 years of silence. Finally, I sat on the bench. He sat beside me, several feet away, like strangers. Maybe that's what we were. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The wind rustled nearby trees. A flag moved gently above the memorial. Eventually, my father broke the silence. I saw the investigation report. I waited. They found enough. His voice sounded hollow. The findings had been devastating. Several estate modifications had been ruled improper. Multiple transfers had been reversed. The final legal consequences were still being resolved. But the truth was no longer in doubt. I know. He stared at the memorial wall. I deserve most of what's happened. The admission surprised me. My father had spent his entire life avoiding responsibility. Yet here he was, accepting it, at least partially. Still, I wasn't ready to make things easy. Most of it, he nodded slowly. Fair question. For several seconds, he gathered his thoughts. Then he surprised me again. I wasn't angry because you joined the army. I blinked. Of all the things I expected him to say, that wasn't one of them. What? I know that's what you believed. It is what you said. I know. His eyes remained fixed on the memorial. But it wasn't the truth. I folded my arms. Then what was? The answer took a long time to come. When it finally did, it arrived in a voice I'd never heard before. A wounded voice. My brother. I frowned. My Uncle Daniel had died long before I was born. The family rarely spoke about him. Almost never. He enlisted when he was 19. My father swallowed. He was killed overseas. The wind seemed to stop. For a moment, the world felt very quiet. I know. No. He shook his head. You know the facts. His eyes grew distant. I remember the funeral. The pain in his voice was unmistakable. I remember my mother crying every night. He stared toward the river. I remember my father never being the same again. I listened, not interrupting. For the first time in my life, my father was letting me see something beneath the armor. Something real. When you told me you'd enlisted, his voice cracked. All I could think about was Daniel. I sat perfectly still. Years of memories suddenly looked different. The arguments, the anger, the criticism, the constant disapproval. I thought I'd lose you too. The words hit me harder than I expected. My father rubbed his face. For a moment, he looked like an exhausted old man. Not the powerful businessman everyone knew. Just an old man carrying decades of grief. I was terrified. He laughed bitterly. And instead of admitting that, he shook his head. I punished you for it. The truth settled heavily between us. Not an excuse. An explanation. Those are very different things. I understood that. He understood it too. I should have been proud of you. His voice trembled. Instead, every promotion made me angry. I stared at him. Not because I doubted him. Because I believed him. Every word. I kept waiting for you to quit. He laughed softly. You never did. No. A faint smile appeared. No. For the first time that morning, we shared something close to humor. Then his smile vanished. His eyes filled with tears, real tears. I had never seen my father cry. Not once. Not when his parents died. Not when businesses struggled. Not ever. Now tears rolled down his face, and he didn't even try to hide them. I failed you. The words came out broken, raw, honest. I failed you as a father. I felt my own eyes sting. Not because everything was suddenly fixed. Nothing was fixed. Years of damage don't disappear in one conversation. But honesty matters. Truth matters. And this was the first completely honest conversation we'd ever had. He looked at me. I am so sorry, Rachel. Not for the estate. Not for the investigation. Not for getting caught. For me. For us. For everything. The difference mattered. A lot. The wind moved through the trees again. Somewhere nearby a church bell rang. Neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable anymore. Just heavy. Human. My father wiped his eyes. I don't expect forgiveness. I looked toward the memorial wall. Rows of names. Rows of stories. Rows of people who had sacrificed. Life teaches difficult lessons. Sometimes far too late. Maybe this was one of them. Finally, I looked back at him. The man who had hurt me. The man who had failed me. The man who was still my father. And for the first time in 20 years, I honestly considered forgiving him. A month after my conversation with my father at the Veterans Memorial Park, the estate case finally came to an end. By then, most of the legal questions had been answered. The investigation had confirmed what the judge had suspected. Several changes to my grandfather's estate had been made improperly. Assets that should never have been redirected were restored. The final ruling wasn't dramatic. No shouting. No shocking television-style courtroom scene. Real life rarely works that way. Instead, there were documents, hearings, corrections, and eventually resolution. My grandfather's wishes were honored.